We now come on to the backbench debate on the 3rd anniversary of the war in Ukraine. And I call Sir Iain Duncan Smith to move. Sir Iain Duncan Smith.
I beg to move the motion in the name of myself and other members on all sides of the House, Mr. Speaker. I have been working on this with many colleagues on other sides of the House for some considerable time, and we have shared that. The one thing I will say about all of this, it may mark us out slightly from other countries, but the reality is in this chamber we have been completely united in our support for Ukraine and the people of Ukraine who are fighting for their freedom, as we have had to do in the past, and we recognise, therefore, the sacrifices and the risks that they have taken. And for anybody to assume straight off that that is of no relevance, I say to them, it is the only relevant issue that pervades this debate today, is that we should always be on the side of those who believe in freedom and democracy. That is what we exist for. I recently came back from another trip to Ukraine. I've done a few there, helped by a charity which is now called Hopeful, and what they had done was quite remarkable. It is another example, I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, of how people in Britain see things sometimes slightly differently from the rest of the world. When Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was serious danger of them taking Kyiv in those early weeks, this charity in Scotland that had been helping support people in difficulty and poorer circumstances in the area around Dundee up sticks and decided that their real cause was now to help those fleeing from the Russians at the border with Poland, which they did. In fact, they turned up 2 weeks earlier than even Oxfam managed to make it by simply getting their trucks and then driving across. It's a very British way of doing things. Eventually they've crossed over the border, and they, over the last 3 years, have supplied many organisations, people, towns, cities, with food. And the way they've done it is to take pizzas and pizza trucks to feed them. And the honourable gentleman was nodding here because he and I were cooking those pizzas close to the front quite recently with them. The fact is they have fed now over 2.5 million Ukrainians in the course of that time of charitable money and of support from other countries, which is quite remarkable. But that charity has now turned its attention to the other huge issue of combat stress and the disaster of the post-war that will haunt Ukraine for those who will suffer internally and externally. I want to come to that in a few minutes. So the reality is that I am therefore proud that they are in the gallery today to watch this. I know we wouldn't normally refer to the gallery, but in this particular instance I think it's quite relevant. And this charity has, in its own accord, launched a rehabilitation programme in Ukraine where they're trying to set up treatment for those with serious combat stress, and then to be able to multiply that out by teaching other veterans to help those through programmes to deal with that combat stress all the way across Ukraine. We have a lot to learn from what they are seeing at the moment, and the figures are absolutely staggering. This addresses the psychological and physical needs and the moral injuries that are huge on a scale that we haven't seen since the Second World War. And we have a lot to learn, interestingly, from Ukraine on the scale of this. And it's worth just looking at a couple of pieces on this. Apart from combat stress, what is quite interesting is the scale of the damage. There are 5 million veterans in Ukraine. 50,000 of these veterans and young people now need prosthetics. I repeat that figure. 50,000 Ukrainians are waiting to get prosthetics. They've lost legs and arms through the mines, through the shells and the shell fire. Civilians have been treated just like soldiers. They have been attacked by the Russians. They bombard hospitals. I've been to hospitals. The military hospital in Kyiv, which I visited, was shelled regularly, deliberately. Who shells hospitals deliberately? Who shells hospitals deliberately? But they did. And the last visit, I visited a wonderful children's hospital in Kyiv, and I think the honourable gentleman was with me when we did that. I'm not sure if he was, but if he was, this had received a hit from a ballistic missile, a direct hit on the Children's Hospital. I must say to the House, you don't get misfires on ballistic missiles. They are targeted to within a yard of their destination point. This was deliberate to blow apart the work that they were doing to help children suffering from cancer and all the other ailments of war as well. This is the real horror of how Russia has fought this war. Yeah. The very fact that they fought the war and invaded Ukraine is bad enough, but they have not stuck to all of the usual rules that apply to those who fight, that you leave civilians out of this as far as you possibly can. They target them. So those 50,000 Ukrainian people, and I went to the prosthetics labs to see this, the thing is, we have a lot to learn from them here as well. They are making advances in prosthetics that we simply couldn't have believed was feasible. And I would say to the government, we really need now to be sending people over there to look at what they're doing and bring that back, because that could be applying to civilian injuries here as well. And so all of the work that the charity is doing is aimed at helping this, and I salute them for that. The thing about this, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that those who say that Ukraine was guilty of the war, of causing the war, honestly, I have been there with the others, and you only have to see the sheer brutality of what has been happening on the ground to recognise the wrongness of any statement that suggests Ukraine somehow caused this war. Mm-hmm. The aggression of Russia was not caused by anybody else. And I will come back to this. It is caused by their greed and avarice and their wrong-headed idea that they can recreate the greater Russia along the old Soviet Union lines. That is what's driving this, and by the way has led to probably over 800,000 dead and injured Russians whose families will never see them, and many, of course, will never see their bodies because they systematically cremate those bodies so there will not be a series of funerals in Russia so that they don't have problems at home. This is the cynicism of that country, and therefore we need to remind everybody, as we didn't think we did, that Ukraine is fighting a war in defence, not in aggression, and it is Russia that has created that problem. And I also want to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, because of all the things that have been going on and milling around in the air and the rows that have been taking place, that we need to take a pace back from this. It's not about pointing fingers at anybody, but it's trying to correct some of the nature of what has been said. I have to say straight off that peace is not just the absence of war. If it was just the absence of war, it in fact becomes a ceasefire, and an intolerable ceasefire that will break down. To have peace that is durable and long-lasting, you need it also to have freedom and justice in it. There can be no real peace without justice for those that have been fighting for their country and for peace. And that has to apply for us in NATO, America and Europe, that we need to recognise there can be no peace unless there is justice in that peace for those who have suffered most.
On that point,
indeed.
My right honourable friend is making a very powerful speech. Does he agree with me that factually the Article 5 Mutual Defence Clause of the Washington Treaty has only ever been invoked once in its history by the United States after 9/11, when President Bush ruled that America had been attacked and NATO Europe, particularly Britain, came to its aid? Does he think it is worth bearing that in mind as these very important discussions take place in Washington?
Well, of course it is, because that Article 5 has been the reason that Western Europe has been able to grow and to settle, and that America has also been able to pursue its own ends because of the mutual defence pact that exists between us. In fact, the United Kingdom, I remember it was Tony Blair, the Prime Minister at that stage, did not waste any time coming out immediately to support them, so much so that he was able to get into the debate that took place in the Congress and to be welcomed as a friend, which was quite right. But the reality was the UK was the first to push this, and Robertson was the head of NATO at the time, and he moved it for the first time. So it was very much the right thing to do, and it is what underpins it. Which I just want to come back, though, to some of the after effects here before I pursue the last of this. I went to see those who look after and are responsible for prisoners of war, Deputy Speaker, in Kiev. And what was fascinating about this was that the abuses that are taking place that trash the Geneva Convention on the support for prisoners of war in Russia. Russia spends its time moving Ukrainian prisoners of war around and does not allow full access to the Red Cross at any stage. Now, this is against the convention, and the Red Cross has complained, but I don't think they've said it loudly enough, that what is going on is some of them are being used as human shields, some of them being used to clear mines in certain areas as prisoners of war, which is against the rules as well. And we also know that a number of families, after serious interrogation of those prisoners of war, which again is illegal, the families of those prisoners of war in Ukraine are then being bullied and threatened about their loved one that is in the prisoner of war camp, if there's such a thing exists, being told that unless they start spying or doing acts of damage in Ukraine, that their husband or son or daughter will themselves be tortured and dealt with. This is going on quite regularly now and has been discovered by the Ukrainians. This is quite illegal under the Geneva Convention, and I would urge the government to speak seriously to the Red Cross about making a much more public statement about this, because this really is quite shocking about the way that you treat prisoners of war. And there's a lack of accountability as well on this, and the Red Cross needs to do much more. So, Deputy Speaker, the reality is that we mustn't therefore underestimate that there has been a change of regime in the United States, and that the President of the United States, President Trump, has made it very clear that, and we shouldn't underestimate this statement, that he wants to see an end to the war. He wants to see an end to 3 years of war, and he says that we have to drive to that. And all of us here, I think, would support that position, that we want to see an end to war. In fact, in Ukraine, they want to see an end to war. Nobody wants to carry on fighting if there is a possibility of a good peace deal that, as I said, has justice and freedom for the Ukrainians in it. But he sees this, I think, as a sideshow. He is more focused, he says, on China and Taiwan and other issues, and I think he wants to make savings back in the United States, which is reasonable on their spending in some of these areas. But the problem is, I just want to reflect on this, for all our support for Ukraine, the reason why this war has gone on for 3 years is because, quite honest, as the Allies, we have really dragged our feet on the supply of the weapons and equipment that Ukraine needed from day one. In fact, there was a period in 2023 when Russia was on the rack and when they were in real problems. They were short of munitions, they had lost territory to the Ukrainians, certainly in the east, around Kharkiv, and that was the moment when Ukraine may well have been able to deal properly with them and push them back. But strangely enough, at that stage, two things seem to have happened. Number one, and this is the point I want to make, the attack, I believe, on Israel by Hamas was not just a standalone item. I think that Iran and China and others had realized that Russia needed a distraction. The Americans, of course, immediately moved to support Israel, which is what they will do, and they supplied arms to them. In fact, I was in the Congress around about that time when I was looking to see if they could get the money through on the bill that was being blocked at the time by some of the Republicans who didn't agree with it. We did manage to persuade a few, and they did push it forward. But the point I would make is, the reality is they said, this is our war in Israel, Ukraine is your war, it's not ours, and we're keen and concerned about Taiwan. And the point I made to them, Madam Deputy Speaker, which I make again here now, is the reality is that you cannot separate Taiwan from Ukraine, or in a way from Israel. My personal view is that China's hand is in all of this, and that distraction, that move of equipment, meant that Russia was able to regain its strength and has done a rapprochement with North Korea. North Korea, interestingly enough, and I think the figures are in here certainly, the scale now of weapons that North Korea is supplying is breathtaking. I think it's now well over 5 million artillery shells have been supplied since they signed the agreement. They have thousands of troops now in Russia, very much defending the Russian position, and they are planning for even more weapons and missiles. And the other point I want to make about this is, which is why this chain of totalitarian states is working to support each other, which they are, is that we are losing on this because we ourselves do not work and focus on this linkage between Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. But I give one small warning, and the Americans need to face this, and the government, I hope, will raise this with them. It's very simply that Russia now, in response, is giving significant technology to the North Koreans, particularly for submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Now, the security services know about that here, but it is a serious and significant shift. If the North Koreans have this technology, they will be able to take their nuclear weapons out to sea and will bring under their target all of the American continent directly with those missiles. Yes. That will change the whole nature of the Pacific in terms of the way that we see geostrategic defense. And it is a major change, and Russia has been giving them that technology. So it's useful for the government to say that this is not separable. Ukraine is the reason for that. So the road to Taiwan runs right through Ukraine, and we cannot separate them, and we must not separate them. And I make the very simple point that where we talk about money, Deputy Speaker, when we speak about money, we know also that there is huge amounts of money, and I know the honourable gentleman who chairs the committee now will want to speak on this, but the reality is we've had debates on this before. There are huge amounts of money that we have now sitting here, the assets belonging to Russians, not just the oligarchs, but also the state. There are some $300 billion of Russian assets frozen within the G7 and the EU. 25 billion of the Central Bank of Russia reserves frozen in the UK alone. And this is managed by Euroclear, and there are Euroclear money in Canada and other countries. Now, the government has said the other day that they are prepared to accept that they may use the money earned from that capital for Ukraine. But I argue that if you're going to use the money that's earned from the capital, you also have a right to use the capital. So what we should do is not just freeze the capital that's sitting in the banks, but let us seize the capital and use it as part of the reparations money and the damage repair and the work that's necessary to go on. And I think you would see a major change immediately. I will, indeed.
Thank you so much for giving way. Can the honourable member explain why there seems to be a certain reluctance amongst Western leaders to use this capital of the $300 billion or so of French state assets in Western banks, because that is something that would be very powerful as part of potential peace negotiations?
Well, I agree. And the reason I think I can understand twofold. Those who have financial services markets are very worried that if they leap out and do this without full agreement, then all those other countries will say, well, that's the last time we will ever invest money in that capital market. We'll move it to the other countries that don't. So I can understand from the government standpoint that this has to be agreed across the G7 at least, who control most of those capital markets. And that means, therefore, that there won't be any country for somebody else to go to, an oligarch or a totalitarian leader. But we've had a long time to get this right. Canada has made the strongest statement of all. I'm told America is was okay under the last administration. I'm not sure, but I would hope President Trump realises this is money that is there. And we should make this agreement as fast as possible. There can be no peace deal if there is not money attached to it. And that money is necessary for Ukraine and must be used for Ukraine. And it's a huge sum. So if we think that we can use the earnings from the capital, then there is no definition or delineation between the two. If you own the earnings, you own the capital. I give away.
I've organised debates on this very topic before in the past. Would he share my view that we now need to get a lot faster in seizing this money, not only to pay for the munitions needed to win the war, but crucially to then win the peace in Ukraine, making good the horrific scale of damage that Russia has inflicted on that great country?
You can't put a piece of paper between the two of us, I have to tell him. He's absolutely right. He now has the capability to push the government over this from his committee standpoint, and I assure him that whatever he chooses to do, this side of the House will support him in that pursuit, and he's quite right. And we need to get these decisions made now, because if they're made now, then it puts pressure on Russia. Because if we've made this decision to seize this money, Russia then is under pressure to reach a reasonable agreement, because they don't want to lose all this money in the meantime. So there is a whole line of pressure that we should be bringing to bear on the Russians. Now, the point about this is also there's more, because we have allowed certain things to take place, and I don't blame just this government. It happened under the last government. Foreign Office is always slightly reluctant to pursue sanctions in quite the aggressive nature that I would want to do it. We recognise that. Everything has always got to be, well, Minister, we must take into consideration a huge number of factors here, such as why, when, who. These need papers, Minister. Well, I would say to them, look, forget the papers. Let's get to the facts. The fact is, for example, we've been allowing a shadow fleet of LNG to come from Russia, even in the last few months, still delivering to the UK and other countries. How can they do that? And the answer is very simple, and I raised this with the government previously, and now, of course, the Americans have stepped in, and they've said any country that takes this gas will be sanctioned. It stopped it overnight. But we could have stopped it because we are the major marine insurers in this country. And actually, it was British companies that were insuring this shadow fleet to take their gas elsewhere. In what world do you sit there, watch that, and string out questions about what you should do? All we had to do was to say that any marine insurer that insured one of these, we're just going to sanction them. And that would be the end of it, because we are the marine insurer market here in the UK. It would have killed it stone dead. America's now moved on this, and you can see some of these ships anchored off places like India and even China now, because they daren't take the gas because of the sanction. So I just urge the government just to want to drive their civil servants to be quicker, faster, more determined to follow the money and to stop it. It just seems to me, and as I say, it's not a criticism alone of the present government, it's a criticism of the government that my party was in power before. Indeed, yeah.
There's many things that we have to address in this debate, but one of the things we also have to address in this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the issue of the atrocities that the Russian forces carried out against Ukrainians, where they butchered, maimed, raped, abused and burnt alive. Those are things that can't be forgotten about, because the families still want justice for their families. They want those who carried them out to be accountable. So when this process of peace, as it moves forward, that has to be part of the peace process, as it was in Northern Ireland.
I completely agree with him. That's going to take time, but it's part of the point that I made. You cannot have a peace if it's a peace without justice. And justice has to prevail, because if it doesn't, then you encourage everybody else to say, whatever we do, we'll get away with next time, because they don't have the courage to pursue the justice angle of peace. We know that. We know that over the last 60 or 70 years, and that's what the Nuremberg trials were all about. That's what the idea for the first time was, to pursue the aggressors, and I think it stands in his case. And I served in Northern Ireland, he knows, and I lost good friends, and I have to say that I'm still wondering what's happened to them, even to this day. So it's going to take a long while, but I accept that. Can I then go on to just say that actually the most interesting thing about these sanctions was I see here again, I'd forgotten, that actually some of these LNG shipments were done by UK firms, and I see Shell was involved in this as well, which made it really quite peculiar why we hadn't stepped onto this earlier. So I just want to bring this to a close, Madam Deputy, because others I know wish to speak. The problem, I think, is that there is an incorrect view, an assumption about the importance of defending Ukraine, which has got lost in this back and forwards row that took place over the last week and a half. The idea that just meeting Putin's demand for territory, that he may have got or not, at the moment somehow will appease him and will satisfy his requirements is, I think, a completely wrong judgment. I noticed in the telephone call between President Trump and Putin, this is what President Trump said was important. The truth is, Putin is an ex-KGB man. Once KGB, always KGB. He's not interested in territory. He's interested in sovereignty. And this is the key difference between the two. I give way to them.
For his powerful speech. I'm originally from West Germany, as most people in this country know, and I remind everybody I would not be here without US presence in Germany. And isn't it not a shame that even in living history and lifetime memory, people seem to have forgotten the powerful status of the US in Western Europe, and we need to remind the American president of that.
Well, yeah, I think he's being reminded of it now in America as well, because there are big arguments taking place about this. But I don't think President Trump has forgotten that. I think what we have to get lined up in here is the real nature of what Putin wants. And it's not territory, it's sovereignty. He wants to recreate, and has always wanted to recreate, the full borders of the old Soviet Union in a greater Russia. We know that. And Ukraine isn't about 20% of their territory. For him, it's all of Ukraine. So you have a peace deal which isn't stable. He will be back. He'll build up his armed forces, which he can do quite quickly now with the support of people like North Korea. And he will be back in double quick time. And who's to say that Ukraine will be any fit state to be able to defend itself? It was only able to defend itself because in the period between the seizure of Crimea in 2014 and the war, we and the Americans had set about training and arming their troops in a way that made them much better when the Russians came in next time round, and as the reason they didn't take Kyiv and were driven back. And that was because we had got ahead of the game with them, and that they'd got a much better armed forces than they had at the time when Russia walked into Crimea. So the reality for us is there needs to be guarantees on anything that happens. And I just don't think that we can separate the Americans from the guarantees. As the Honourable Lady says, it is, of course, America that at the end of the day is the ultimate guarantor. Now, by the way, I agree with the Americans that the West has ridden on the coattails of the United States for far too long. Yeah. We have been guilty of that. Yeah. We have lived a life that has allowed us to say, well, defence spending, well, we'll claim it's this, but it's not really this, and there'll be bits in it. That is one of the reasons why President Trump right now is angry about the idea that they should be expected to take this on. So we have to step up, and I'm pleased the Prime Minister has started that process, and I wish him all the best in Washington, but stepping up to increase defence spending absolutely has to happen. And, you know, I made a point to him last time I spoke that there was a period when we faced the greatest threat that we had faced when Russia put, or Soviet Union put SS-20s into Europe, threatening us. It was Reagan and Thatcher that helped lead Western Europe, supported by Helmut Kohl and others, to take the tough decision to put Pershing and cruise missiles in to counter that. That was a brave decision run by leadership, but centred on the UK and the US. He needs to remind President Trump that when the UK and the US are together in a just cause, the world is a safer place. When we are divided, it is less safe. I don't care what anybody else says. That relationship is critical to peace and justice in the world. And I hope that he succeeds in achieving that. And so we know that, therefore, President Putin is keen only on sovereignty. And the reality is that this is critical in our understanding of what peace would amount to. So I want to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, by simply saying, if we lose sight of the idea that somehow Ukraine is unimportant, it's not. It's important to America in a way sometimes I don't think they fully understand. I said earlier on that the road to Taiwan and the threats of Taiwan, if we think, by the way, the cost of the war in Ukraine damaged us to the cost of about $1 trillion on the global economy, any seizure of Taiwan would be near a $10 trillion effect on the economy. For those who say, why should we in this country be worried about Taiwan? I say, in that area around Taiwan, 72% of everything produced today in the world is made there. You tell me that's not as important as Kent is to the United Kingdom. It's exactly the same. So the road to Taiwan runs through Ukraine. Why? Because when we fail on Ukraine, when Ukraine gets a terrible deal, when China looks at this and says, you know what, they're never going to step in here, it's too far away, they won't do it, they never do, they fell out of Afghanistan, they didn't do anything when Crimea was taken, they've given in to us over Ukraine completely, they will do the same over Taiwan. That is why the road goes to Taiwan, and we will be left behind because we will not have taken the right decision. And it also means, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I hope the Prime Minister reminds President Trump of this also, that if we fail on this, then it opens the world again to the rule of totalitarian states who will come again and again. As Churchill said, the bitter cup that will be proffered to us again and again and again. And every time we fail, every time we don't stand up for those who struggle for freedom or democracy or justice, then they will take that and move on. We've learnt this lesson so many times, but we seem to forget it and have to learn it again. Madam Deputy Speaker, what happens today over Ukraine, over those brave men and women who have lost so much and are going to lose even more yet, if we are not with them and find a way for them to remain a free nation of free people and of choice, then we are not worth the thousands of years of experience and of the fights that we have put up previously. All will become naught because totalitarianism will rule the day.
Yeah. The question is, as on the order paper, as you can see, we've got quite a few people who wish to contribute, so we'll have to put a time limit of 5 minutes to begin with, and I call Linsey Farnsworth.
Deputy Speaker, I'd like to start by thanking the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green and his team for securing this important debate today. I know he's long been a champion for Ukraine and the fight against Russia. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are members on both sides of this House who have been loudly supporting the Ukrainian cause and have made excellent contributions in debates prior to today, and I'm looking forward to hearing their contributions in this debate as well. And I know that many members have recently returned from the country and have seen for themselves firsthand the horror that has been inflicted upon the Ukrainian people. Having visited the country in September myself, I vividly remember my experience. The cardiology hospital in Kyiv having been hit while children were on the operating table. The cellar of a school I visited in Chernihiv Oblast, where in March 2022 over 300 villagers, including women and children, were rounded up and held captive. Valerie, a former captive held at the school, will forever be haunted by what he saw and experienced. Over 100 people stuffed into a room, the room so crowded people were gasping for air, including a baby less than 2 months old. I asked Valerie how he could have had the strength to go back there and revisit the site with us. He said it was a story that had to be told, and that people needed to understand the lack of humanity of those Russian soldiers. That school will be forever a marker of the brief occupation of their Russian occupation of their village. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's remarkable that 3 years after the start of the full-scale invasion, in cities in Ukraine, civilians can still sit in cafes and restaurants and life appears normal. That is, until the air raid siren sounds. A haunting reminder that the Ukrainians are sacrificing a great deal, and not just making sacrifices for themselves, but for us, our values, and our freedoms. Madam Deputy Speaker, whether it be our predecessors standing with Churchill or the creation of NATO under the stewardship of Ernest Bevin, the Labour Party's record on defence has stood the test of time. So I'm so proud to live in a country which has stood up and stood tall in the face of Russian tyranny and imperialism, not only through supporting the Ukrainian military, but also through our welcoming of those fleeing this war. The United Kingdom has welcomed over 218,000 people who fled the conflict through the Ukraine Family Scheme and Homes for Ukraine sponsorship scheme. And in the East Midlands, we've taken 8,739 people, with those in my local authority of Amber Valley welcoming in nearly 250 Ukrainians. Madam, I don't want to spend time restating words and sentiments across this House who are supporting Ukraine today. I'm sure that many on the front lines aren't paying much attention to our platitudes and tributes while waves of Russian assault pummel them, nor those in the cities sheltering from what was only a few days ago the largest drone attack of the war, comforted by words alone. No matter how beautiful our rhetoric is, Ukrainians don't sleep any better at night through those words. So I welcome the decision to bring forward the 2.5% spending commitment to 2027. And this money cannot come soon enough for the people that I met in Ukraine. And I also welcome the further money allocated to our intelligence agencies to protect this country from the various threats Russia now poses, including, of course, cyber attacks. And I welcome the government leading the way, whether it's the latest round of sanctions that my friend has already mentioned, that were announced by the Foreign Secretary on Monday, or the Defence Secretary chairing the Ukraine Defence Contact Group at NATO a few weeks ago. There is, of course, much more that we can do, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would urge the government to consider returning the children abducted from Russia, as already been mentioned. Thank you.
Caroline Dinenage.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd really like to start by thanking my right honourable friend for calling this debate, and I was really pleased to support his application to the Backbench Select Committee. I'd like to start actually by not reading what I've written on my bit of paper, but what I've just scribbled somewhere else, because I want to start by saying something about the Ukrainian people. I don't think anyone, least of all Vladimir Putin, actually, when he launched his illegal invasion 3 years ago, understood what he was taking on in the Ukrainian people, the spirit, the ingenuity, the incredible ability to innovate and to make the most of every single asset at their disposal, to face up to a new form of warfare where we're not only facing the old school tanks and trenches and almost hand-to-hand combat, but at the same time the high-tech, the drones, the digital, the modern equipment. It shows beyond any doubt, and it is a cautionary tale to others, I think, who are thinking of invading a sovereign nation, how far people will go, how hard they will fight when they are fighting for their friends and when they're fighting for their neighbours and they're fighting for their families, and how desperately they will defend their homelands and their independence and their language and their identity. And I think it's something that we should all take a moment to reflect upon and to pay tribute to them and their incredible bravery. I also want to pay tribute to the British people who've reacted to this dreadful situation with so much warmth and of course the government too. We our government and opposition united acted very swiftly in the first days of that unprovoked and illegal invasion. Prime Minister Johnson did lead from the front in his defence of Ukraine and their right to sovereignty and independence. And he did set the pace for other European countries to follow. And he had the backing of the British people. We care about this. We care about this in my area, in Gosport, because we have skin in the game. It's an area with a very proud history of serving our armed forces, particularly the Royal Navy. And because so typically of the generosity of spirit of Gosport people, so many Ukrainians quite literally made it their home. And at this point, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to declare an interest because one of those homes was and still is mine. I saw the Russian tanks rolling into the Donbass and towards Kyiv, and I couldn't stand by and do nothing, so my husband and I joined the Homes for Ukraine scheme. I've never publicly spoken about that before. Gosport welcomed over 300 Ukrainians to our area, and a few weeks after we signed the Homes for Ukraine scheme, my family and I were boosted by two women who are still with us. I now refer to them as my Ukrainian wife and my Ukrainian daughter. And they and many others have been in the UK for almost 3 years now. And I will, yes.
Many refugees, like she just describes, they have a 3-year visa, but these visas are running out. Does she worry with me that the government needs to look at the extension scheme and make sure that all Ukrainians who we've welcomed will have the ability to plan for a long-term future?
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's almost as if she'd read what I've got written on my bit of paper in front of it. It's miraculous. I want to know what the lottery numbers are for next week now. And she's exactly right, because my own Ukrainian family, I call them family because they are now part of my family, have made lives for themselves here in this country, and they've become an asset to our community. And in the event of a sustainable peace deal, Ukraine will, of course, want and need its brightest and best to return back to rebuild its country. But I know that so many of them simply don't have anything to go back to, Madam Deputy Speaker, such as the devastation that's been wrought by Russia. 167,000 civilian buildings have been destroyed by Russia. UNESCO says almost 500 cultural sites have been lost too as a result of Russia's attempt to erase Ukrainian heritage. And so many of the communities that Ukrainians have fled just won't be the same. They won't have anything to go back to. They'll miss the familiar landmarks, the meeting places, and most importantly of all, and most sadly, the people that they wanted to go back to as well. So, I will.
She and the other honourable member made about visas for Ukrainian refugees. I wonder if they recognise that the government has actually already extended the visa scheme by 18 months. That was a decision that was made this month and has been welcomed, at least by the Ukrainian refugees in my constituency.
Yes, and I think that has been very welcome. I think what a lot of people from the Ukrainian community want is that certainty, is to know what to expect, and that security of the world around them. But I guess, following on from one of the comments we heard earlier, what I want to ask the Minister is, we hear a lot about planning for the war, but I want to know a little bit more about what the government is doing to plan for the peace, and how we work towards a day when many Ukrainians will be able to return to their home country. But what about those who are here under the scheme and have made their home here, who have made relationships here, who have jobs here, who are contributing to economies and the communities in which they live? Will they be able to stay indefinitely? I think that's a question that people are now beginning to ask, and as much as we understand that Ukraine will want their brightest and best back, there are some who simply don't have anything to go back to. So to conclude, going forward, contrary to the messaging coming out of the Munich Security Conference, there are values that we all share as European countries, which we must now pay to defend, but we must also not just use words, we must show action, and we must show solidarity. And I suppose I really wanted to give the Minister, who I know cares about this very deeply, the opportunity to reaffirm their commitment that as the geopolitical weathers change, our dedication as a nation, as a government, as an opposition to Ukraine and its incredible, indefatigable people and their democratically elected president will never waver.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend for calling this debate, and I was proud to support him in it. I was with him on that trip to Ukraine a few weeks ago with that fantastic charity, Hopeful, that he referenced earlier. If you told me a year ago that a year later I would have been stood with the Conservative Sir Iain Duncan Smith in the snow cooking pizzas in Ukraine, I would never have believed you. But it was a fascinating visit and an important one. And it highlights the cross-party nature of the support that my right honourable friend, I will say, has pointed out. It's so important, particularly in comparison to other countries. And I would also say there's a role cross-party as backbenchers for us to put pressure on our respective front benches to make sure we're working together on this issue going forward into the future as well. We're marking, obviously, the 3-year point of this absolutely terrible war, a war started by Vladimir Putin, an illegal war, a war of brutality and of barbarism, a conflict where Ukraine is very literally fighting for its life, for its existence as a free and independent nation-state. And as the first line of the national anthem of Ukraine says, the glory and freedom of Ukraine has not yet perished, despite the best efforts of the dictator Vladimir Putin. And we heard earlier something of the scale of that war and the destruction that it has wrought. Hundreds of thousands of deaths of young men and women on all sides of that conflict, I should say. Thousands of civilians, women, girls, boys have been killed, many millions injured. And of course refugees. We've heard about refugees, 7 million Ukrainian refugees, almost many more internally displaced people. And the longer they're away from their homes, the less likely it is that they return as well. Civilian casualties rose by 30% in the last year of this war. Russia has increased its use of aerial bombs, drones, missiles, loitering munitions. We heard of the Ukrainian hospital that has been visited by many honourable members in Kyiv, their version of Great Ormond Street. What kind of a regime deliberately targets a hospital? Because that's what it was. Landmines are now contaminating 139,000 square kilometres of Ukraine, posing a real risk to civilians and the future of the country. And 306 attacks in the last 12 months were on medical facilities, 576 attacks on schools, nearly double the previous year. And disgracefully, we've talked about the rules of war not being followed by Vladimir Putin's armed forces. The UN has recorded an alarming spike in the number of Ukrainian soldiers being executed by the Russian armed forces. There are credible allegations of at least 81 executed in the last 6 months. And people have made reference to Ukrainian prisoners of war who are subjected to appalling crimes, torture, sexual violence, and much, much more. And the children. You know, Vladimir Putin faces a warrant by the ICC. What for? For abducting thousands of children. The Yale School of Public Health's Humanitarian Research Lab says that conservatively there are at least 6,000 children held at camps in Russia at the moment. And the incredible spectre of North Korean troops fighting on this continent for a terrible dictatorship. So I want to talk very briefly, because time is short, about the security guarantees, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Ukraine needs. And one of the concerns I have as the discussion develops about a peace in Ukraine is the way Vladimir Putin is suggesting there should be limits on the Ukrainian armed forces themselves after a peace. The best security guarantee there is the one that is operating at the moment, which is a well-equipped, well-armed Ukrainian armed force. Yeah. The brave men and women of Ukraine that have held back Vladimir Putin's evil army. The first principles in any discussion about security guarantees or a peace is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Yeah. And a further principle in those negotiations, Madam Deputy Speaker, has to be understanding the character of the man we're dealing with. He is a compulsive liar who breaks his word at every opportunity. So that's why those guarantees are so incredibly important. Naturally, after Munich and some of the destabilising comments made by some characters in foreign governments, it is natural to be cautious in this space, and we should be hard-headed and talk very realistically about what Britain needs to do. But I'll give way. Thank you.
Does he find it ironic that the conference at Munich was like a shadow of the previous conference at Munich that gave away the Sudetenland and made certain the Second World War would take place? Does he think that we may end up in the same position if we're not careful?
I do, and actually I think one of the interesting things coming out of Munich and of the recent discussions is some of the stuff is not new news. The United States has been telling Europe to pay for its own defence and step up for many, many years. If the commitments made in Wales in 2014 of 2% had been kept by all the countries that signed up to them, we would have spent another $800 billion on our collective defence since that time. So countries do need to step up and make sure they're meeting their commitments. And we need to be realistic about our role in this. We're a leading European partner, a leading member of NATO, and we're a leading ally of the United States. And I do worry that the last 2 weeks, some people have been very quick to throw out 80 years of the important transatlantic alliance. It is crucial for the security of this country, but also for the security of our continent. I'll give way.
For that comment, does he agree that talking about the end of NATO is a very dangerous way of putting it? We in Europe cannot continue with NATO without the United States in it, and it is important to remind the United States of it.
Honourable Member, I completely agree with her, and that's why I've been reassured that the government has talked about us having a NATO-first defence policy, and the Prime Minister reaffirmed that this week. And I should say, with all the drama there's been in the last couple of weeks, what has been reassuring is the steady hand and leadership that the Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary and the government as a whole have shown on these issues. They have reacted calmly, coolly, to the challenge that have been posed, and the whole House yesterday, you saw, gave the Prime Minister their very good wishes and very good luck in the urgent task he has with President Trump of convincing him of the importance of Ukraine to the security not only of the United States and of Europe, but of its link, the very important link that my honourable friend made, to dictatorships across the world, and not allowing the principle of might is right to succeed, because then we go down a very, very dangerous road indeed. When this country was fighting for its life, and of course there is a dangerous tendency of British politicians to always refer back to that time, so I'm going to fall into that trap. Harry Hopkins, President Roosevelt's great personal friend, was here in the UK visiting Glasgow, and he gave a speech to reassure Churchill in those dark days of December 1940. He gave a speech in Glasgow, which he finished with a quote from the Book of Ruth. "Whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, even to the end." That should be Britain, Europe and the United States' attitude to Ukraine: solidarity, unyielding support, and remembering that the glory and freedom of Ukraine has not yet perished.
James MacCleary.
Speaker, and thank you to the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for bringing forward this debate and giving me the opportunity to support it. The third anniversary of Russia's latest full-scale invasion of Ukraine is a point at which we must all reflect, not just on the war itself, but on what's at stake for all of us. Last week I attended a gathering in my constituency where I met Ukrainians who, I'm happy to say, have found a home in Lewes and across Sussex. Many of them arrived in the UK fleeing war, but they have done far more than rebuild their own lives. They've formed support networks, kept Ukrainian culture alive. I can tell you their singing is really beautiful. And have sent aid back home, including Christmas presents for children in Ukrainian hospitals. Children whose lives have been shattered by Russian bombs. I often think of those children still in Ukraine, children just like mine who 3 years ago would have just gone to school in the morning, come home, played with their friends and siblings, had a bit of dinner, gone to bed, only to be woken up in the night by air raid sirens, being rushed by their parents to underground bomb shelters, listening to Russian missiles smash into their homes above their heads. Madam Deputy Speaker, that's the reality of this war. Innocent people, families and children whose only crime was living in a country that Putin decided to target. But as we can all see, Ukrainian resistance has been nothing short of heroic. For 3 years against the odds, the Ukrainian people have proudly stood their ground, fighting not just for their own freedom, but for the kind of world we all want to live in. And Britain must be clear, we stand with Ukraine. From day one, the UK has not only provided military aid and training, but also economic pressure on Russia. British families have opened their homes to Ukrainian refugees, but today the West's commitment is being tested in ways I never thought I'd witness. With President Trump peddling Russian propaganda directly from the White House, the future of US support is uncertain. But let me be clear, if America wavers, then Britain and Europe must step up. That entails action, not just words. Ukraine must have the necessary weapons, economic support and long-term investment not only to survive, but to win. This means going even further, defrosting and seizing the billions in frozen Russian assets stashed in London, Paris, Berlin and elsewhere, and converting them into a financial lifeline for Ukraine. And the threat is not limited to Ukraine. the Right Honourable Member mentioned Taiwan and how that part of the world is so heavily affected by this. But I draw attention to Russia's hybrid warfare closer to home, where it is targeting and destabilising countries such as Georgia, Moldova, Romania, Belarus and elsewhere. Kremlin-backed elites like Belarus dictator Alexander Lukashenko or Georgian oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili are working to undermine democracy and pull their countries back into Moscow's orbit. Britain cannot allow Putin's cronies to operate unchecked. We must follow the US and European Parliament in sanctioning those enabling his war machine. If Putin is allowed to win in Ukraine, he won't stop there. He will redraw Europe's borders by force and other tyrants will be watching. This isn't just about defending Ukraine's sovereignty. It is about defending the liberal, rules-based international order that safeguards us all. An order that our nation helped to build to constrain great powers from exploiting the less powerful by, for instance, extracting valuable raw materials at the point of a gun. Some say Britain should step back, abandon our allies and retreat from global leadership, but history will judge the choices we make now. Do we appease aggression or stand firm in the face of tyranny? And as has been previously mentioned, I know that we all wish the Prime Minister well in having these sorts of discussions with the US President today. There is no middle ground. We either let Putin tighten his grip on Europe or we push back. Now we look to the future. Any peace deal must be just that, not a temporary ceasefire to allow Putin's forces to rest, rearm and go again. It must be backed with real security guarantees and to clearly state that Russia started this war and they bear responsibility for its consequences. Some speak about picking sides in the new geopolitical landscape. But there is only one side that the UK can back, the side of freedom, rule of law and the liberal international order, the side that reflects the values of this country and, I believe, this House. So there is no middle ground. We either let Putin tighten his grip on Europe or we push back. Push back by arming Ukraine, push back by crippling Russia's war economy, push back by standing unwavering in our commitment to Ukraine's victory because their fight is our fight too. This is a battle for freedom, a battle for justice, and a battle we cannot afford to lose.
Baxter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the member for Chingford and Wood Green for bringing forward the debate today, and I'm happy to support it. Like some other colleagues in the chamber today, I spent Sunday evening in an underground bomb shelter in Kyiv as Russia launched a massive drone attack on the city and across many others across Ukraine. Whilst it was a terrifying experience, I was proud to join the UK's cross-party delegation to Ukraine to mark the third anniversary of Putin's illegal invasion into Ukraine. It is, of course, a grim milestone in a conflict that has claimed the lives of thousands of innocent Ukrainian civilians and displaced many, many more. As the only female MP on the delegation, I do think it would be remiss of me not to tell the House about the vital role Ukrainian women are playing in this conflict. James Brown once said, "It's a man's world, but it would be nothing without a woman." The strength and bravery takes many forms, and Ukrainian women are showing extraordinary resilience, not just in defending Ukraine against Russian aggression, but in rebuilding a nation that refuses to be broken. As the House will know, when Russian forces invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, President Zelensky ordered that all able-bodied men from 18 to 60 years old were to remain in the country to bolster Ukraine's defences. But Ukrainian women also stepped up. Today, more than 50,000 women are signed up to the Ukrainian army. 1 in 10 of those women hold a senior position, and more than 4,000 are directly engaged in frontline combat. This week, I had the pleasure of meeting some of the women who have served on the front line. There was no mandatory conscription for Ukrainian women, meaning that every single woman that has signed up has done so voluntarily, driven by their immovable resolve to defend their home. But women are also playing a vital role off the battlefield. They have been vital in sustaining the economy against Putin's war machine. Ukraine have changed the law so that women can fill labour gaps in mining, transportation, logistics, agriculture, ensuring those critical sectors continue to function in the face of bombardment and destruction from Putin's forces. Today, 1 in every 2 new businesses started in Ukraine will be started by a woman. And I met women who are camped out in drone factories, making the kit that is being sent to the front line. They do all of this whilst many of them have lost their fathers, their brothers, their husbands. I'll give way.
I think the Honourable Lady makes a very, very powerful point, and there are times in this place when it is very, very difficult to speak and to remain and keep one's composure. She's doing a fantastic job, Madam Deputy Speaker. But I think we would all agree with her that our hearts go out to those Ukrainian people, and they certainly deserve all our support.
I thank the Honourable Member for her statement. Whilst those Ukrainian women are fighting and sustaining their country, they are also the mothers to the 19,546 children who have been kidnapped by Russia. And I want to tell the House about why point 4 of President Zelensky's peace formula is so vital to ensuring a just end to this war. When Russian forces invaded the eastern oblasts in Ukraine, they deported and forcibly removed children from Ukraine to Russia. This is genocide as we know it in international law. In one case, a child just only 8 months old was taken by Russian forces. His new name and date of birth are unknown. Russia has consistently denied the existence of this child and thousands of others. Some of the children end up in Russia's youth military, conscripted to fight a war against a country they were born in. This is a war crime, and before any ceasefire, the 19,546 stolen children of Ukraine must be returned home. Talk of tanks and bullets and drones and machine guns is unlikely to move the minds of many people who live so far from Ukraine. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's the women that are playing an essential role in this war, and it's their stories who will move the minds of people who live so far away from Ukraine. And it's their story, their fight for survival, their fight for the values of democracy, which we in this House hold so dear and must support them with every might that we have. Slava Ukraini.
Dr. Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I start by congratulating my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, on securing this important debate, but also salute him for the incredible work he has done in leading on this issue. And as always, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is hugely heartening to see so many colleagues from across the House in the Chamber today, and it serves as a timely reminder of the united approach that we have taken on this issue and our resolute support for the Ukrainian people, which has not diminished. In my own constituency, we have welcomed many Ukrainian families, and I am always touched and moved by their stories of resilience in the face of greatest hardship. Now, many have spoken before me, Madam Deputy Speaker, not just in this debate, but through the course of the week, on the importance of the announcement, the welcome announcement by government in terms of increased defence spending, and the need for our allies also to step up to the game. Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't intend to repeat those arguments today, but I will add that it is not us alone who determines our defence spending. It is our enemies, but it is also our allies. With the United States announcing a potential step back from their support for Ukraine, it is clear that we as a nation have an overriding obligation, not only to Ukraine, but to our citizens and the wider world, to step up and keep Putin's war machine at bay. If we fail to do so, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are opening the gates to totalitarian regimes across the world and moving forwards. But the reality is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the United Kingdom has an armed forces which are fit for peace. But over the last 8 months or so, we've entered a much more dangerous arena, and we need to be ready for any outcome. And in the time available to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to raise 2 points.
Firstly, reiterating the point from my right honourable friend in terms of the increasingly pressing need to release and commit the release of those £300 billion in frozen Russian assets in order to aid the Ukrainian government in the rebuild of their country. But the second point, and it picks up from the comments of my right honourable friend in his opening remarks, about what we must learn from this conflict and what we can learn as an armed forces in this country. Because what we have seen from the heroic efforts of the Ukrainian military, many making the ultimate sacrifice in the defence of the sovereignty of their country, is that we, as an armed forces, as I say, can learn from this. What the war has shown is that there is a clear shift in the nature of warfare, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the nature of each serving personnel's working realities. War is now a much more hybrid state, fought along traditional land, maritime and sea realms, but also back in bases in remote locations. And yet, we still follow traditional medical guidelines on who can serve and who does not have the opportunity to do so. And this is where I feel, Madam Deputy Speaker, we can learn from Ukraine, who very early on in the conflict amended and adjusted many of the medical requirements for their serving personnel. Now, in our military, there is often a mindset of soldier first, which will lead that there's an exemption from someone who may have suffered from a knee injury whilst playing sport at school, anyone with Raynaud's phenomenon, for example, or anyone wearing glasses over a certain prescription. Madam Deputy Speaker, rather than making a generic medical exemption list for the whole force, I would invite the Minister to at least consider tailoring the medical requirements to the position being applied for. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the reality is, what are the chances of your glasses being blown off if you're operating from a chair in a drain centre many, many miles or hundreds of miles away? What is the reality of an intelligence officer in a remote location looking at satellite information, losing the feeling in their fingers due to the cold because of the Raynaud's phenomenon? Or what are the chances, Madam Deputy Speaker, of a Royal Navy dental officer not being able to complete a check-up because of pain in his knee? So we need to be much more flexible. And whilst I accept there's a certain degree of hyperbole in my argument, Madam Deputy Speaker, the point I'm making is a serious one. If we are to turn the tide on our recruitment policy and difficulties in this country, we need to tailor the medical requirements to the specific role. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must become more versatile and adaptive as a fighting force, like our friends in Ukraine. And as a country, we are often guilty of preparing for the war that we have had rather than the war we will face in the future. So as we reflect on the 3 years since Putin's illegal invasion, I invite the government not to waste any more time and learning from what we have from the cost of so many thousand Ukrainian lives.
Then.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me congratulate the right honourable gentleman for securing this debate and for everyone who has spoken. It was Václav Havel, Madam Deputy Speaker, who said that the best defence against tyranny is to live in truth. And so on this 3rd anniversary, we have the opportunity to repeat some truths to this House, that Ukraine is a democracy, that democracies need defending, and the best way to defend democracies is for democratic nations to come together with a unity of purpose around our values. Now, we should not have to remind the world that Ukraine is a democracy, but some have impugned it. And yet we know in this House that at times all democracies face challenges. Let's be honest, this country once had to suspend elections during the height of World War II. Gosh, I am even old enough to remember when thousands of people invaded the United States Congress because they wanted to overturn a democratic election there and nullify the result and the election of President Biden. So let us be very clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, and send a message from this House that we do not regard President Zelensky as a dictator. We regard President Zelensky as a hero of democracy, and we in the West should have his back. Second, we have to remember that at times democracies will need defending, especially against dictators, especially when it comes to Russia. President Zelensky is on the front line of an effort to recontain Russia on behalf of all of us. Russia is a country that invades its neighbours time and time and time again. They have been invading their neighbours since the days of Ivan the Terrible. They have been invading their neighbours on 8 different occasions since 1945. They have invaded their neighbours on average once every decade since the end of the Second World War. Faced with that threat, why on earth would we make concessions now? 700,000 people have been lost in this war in Russia. Russia now faces a NATO that is bigger and stronger. Russia is going to run out of T-80 tanks in April. They have lost more artillery systems in the last year than in the previous 2 years put together. Russia, at the height of the war, controlled 19.6% of Ukrainian territory. Today, they control less, 19.2%. In the face of that weakness, why on earth would we make concessions now to those who want to make Russia great again? We should confront them with strength and not weakness, because that is how peace is secured. The final point I just wanted to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that it is vital for us across the West now to unite around our values and to celebrate those values and not to attack each other. I am worried that what began as political improvisation in the United States has now become, under the new president, a political project. And I am worried about some of the noises that I hear that sound like, frankly, the report that Thucydides made of the Athenian threat all those centuries ago, that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Well, in this country, we know how that story ends. When we talk about the rules-based order, we don't mean the rules of the poker table. What we mean is not simply the rules that we set out at the end of World War II. We don't simply believe in a rules-based order, we believe in a rights-based order. The rights that ensure our freedom, that were enshrined in the UN Declaration on Human Rights at the end of World War II and in the and in the Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights, co-authored by this country, based on Churchill's great vision of a great charter. Those are the rights that we should be celebrating because they mean freedom for all of us. Now, those rights, those values, those freedoms have to be defended with strength. And so the Prime Minister's decision to increase defence spending was right. This House will need reassurance that money can be well spent. But crucially, given the cuts that are now involved to the aid budget, we must think hard, creatively and quickly about how we now lead a great multilateral effort to increase the amount of aid spending around the world. We need to think in this 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions how we reinvent the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund for new times so that they are bigger and better in the world to come. That is the way that we become evangelists for the rights that are now being defended so valiantly by Ukrainian forces on the continent of Europe.
Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for bringing forward this important debate. And I recognise that, quite rightly, the debate has focused on our responsibility to support Ukraine's war effort against Putin's unprovoked and illegal attack in Ukraine. I would like to talk about our continued commitment to those Ukrainians here, as the members for Gosport and Bath both mentioned in their contributions. Since the start of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, over 218,000 Ukrainians have arrived in the UK under the Ukraine Family and Sponsorship Scheme. I'm incredibly proud of my constituency of Chichester that has taken more Ukrainian refugees than any other city in this country, and they have now become a valued part of our community. So now more than ever, we must stand firmly with our Ukrainian friends, both defending their sovereign territory, but also ensuring that those here are able to live safely and comfortably. The original visa scheme, as the Minister will know, was for 3-year visas, and with the 3-year anniversary marked this week, many of those visas are now expiring. Ukrainians have been asked by the government to apply for the Ukrainian Permission Extension Scheme, which will extend their visa for a further 18 months. However, they are only allowed to apply for that extension scheme when their visa has 28 days or less left on it. This is causing a myriad of difficulties for that community, including their ability to renew employment contracts, extend leases or find new accommodation and set up new leases on rented accommodation, or commit to education opportunities. So I recently had the opportunity to visit Bishop Luffer School in Chichester last month, and I met a group of Ukrainian students who not only have become well-liked pupils by staff and students, but have also excelled in their studies and are expected to finish their A-levels with high grades across the board in subjects like mathematics and the sciences. Those students that I met are the doctors and the scientists of the future. Yet there is no clear direction from the Department of Education with regards to how these students should pursue higher education, be it via the same routes as their UK counterparts that they've studied with, or as refugees, or as international students. I have raised this with the Secretary of State for Education, and I hope that there will be clearer guidance in the near future for those students that are desperate to study in the UK.
Would you give way?
Happily give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I've spoken to many Ukrainian families who have made their homes in Glastonbury and Somerset after fleeing Russians' the aggression of Ukraine. But many of them are concerned about the decision to exclude time spent in the UK under the long residence route. And that's different to other schemes, and it could be subject to costly legal challenges. Does my honourable friend share my concerns over this?
I thank the honourable member for her intervention, and I absolutely share her concerns that the time spent here is not counting towards right to remain or settled status. And as the honourable member for Gosport mentioned, they have found homes, they have built communities here in the UK, and they just like to know either way what's going to happen to them in the future. And the young people that I was speaking about are often cared for by one parent or grandparents, while their other family members defend Ukraine's sovereign country. Some families have reported that estate agents are requesting from these single-parent families a 6-month deposit up front to rent to Ukrainian families, which is untenable across the country, but especially in areas like Chichester, where the average one-bedroom flat is £1,200 a month. Employers are also asking for proof of visa status, which is causing the families additional stress when they are waiting for a visa decision, sometimes just days before their visa expires. And for those Ukrainians on zero-hour contracts, it's directly impacting their ability to earn money, to contribute to UK society and provide a safe roof over their heads for them and their dependents. If the Ukrainians were given a window of 90 days from expiration of their visa, which was originally proposed by the Home Office, rather than the very short time frame they are being given, the situation could be vastly improved. And I would like to thank Apora, which is the UK charity supporting Ukrainians here in the UK, for all the support that they are giving those families navigating what can quite often be a complicated, convoluted and long process reapplying for these schemes, and also for giving me the time to brief me properly on the situation that these families are finding themselves in. So I know the conversation today will quite rightly be dominated by what we can do for Ukraine and our steadfast support, which is shared across the House. But I hope the Minister is working closely with his Home Office colleagues so that while we support those brave Ukrainians heroically defending their country, we can also continue to support the community of Ukrainians here in the UK.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, I read through a speech I made 3 years ago. Ukrainians and President Zelensky have displayed the highest level of bravery in the face of ruthless Russian aggression. In the eyes of Vladimir Putin, Ukraine made the unforgivable choice to decide on independence and a democratic free country. Like all dictators, Putin was terrified of losing power. It did not fit with his plan of the Great Russia again. But Ukrainians had made the choice. They wanted to be a European country, wanted to become a member of NATO, wanted to make their own choices. Make no mistakes, Ukrainians were fighting this war on behalf of all of us, and all of us are part of a free and just and democratic world. I said then we must support them as if the future of our country and our way of life depends on it, because quite frankly it does, and the world is watching the conflict. The dictators of the world have become emboldened over the past decade, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Russia will itself push further, with Moldova seemingly next, back from 3 years ago. My speech went on to urge more action, as Ukraine was asking for help, and each day these decisions were being deliberated over. Possibly, I've changed it to possibly. It should have been done at a much quicker pace. It should have been achieved. But it's like it's been said earlier here, we're not fighting this properly. We're not together. No, but the world is not together. It's a big issue, this. It's not just a fight between two countries. It's Russia. It's Putin. And he is an evil, evil man. He's KGB, his colleague, friend over there. Thank you for the opening speech. It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. His KGB is inhuman. Just to point something out, North Korea is well in this. They are there. They've been working together. China, Iran, North Korea. They're all working at this together. It's been planned. I agree entirely with what's been said earlier today. There are North Koreans, so there's North Koreans here on Monday, Tuesday night, I was with them, and they are fighting. They've got 100,000 at Russia's disposal in Ukraine, and when they get killed and maimed, they burn their faces and hands off so they cannot be recognised as North Koreans. And that is how evil this man is, Putin. He took 14 and he took Crimea without any consequences. Putin orchestrated the bombings that resulted in the deaths of 300 of his own people to help to start a war to take power. He had his political rivals shot for opposing war, approved poisoning on British soil that resulted in the death of British citizens, pre-recorded his declaration of war on Ukraine, after which he pretended to be open to diplomacy. Putin will not stop. You cannot appease this man. I understand why NATO could not get directly involved, yet short of that, we should have been doing absolutely everything at a much speedier pace. But the thing, I don't point a finger of blame at anybody. We're not looking at this as seriously as it is. We are there. It's as much a calamity as 1945. Last week, the world was shocked. To quote Will Hutton in The Observer, the 23rd of Sunday, the spilled Ukrainian blood counted for nothing as the elected President of the United States openly sided with Russia to achieve a peace that can only reward it for its unilateral aggression. As profoundly as the US President has launched a new era in which might is right, strong men carve up the globe, and international law and multinational institutions are eviscerated. Nor, as the former head of M16 said, Alex Younger, told BBC's Newsnight, there is no going back. Our thoughts and support are with our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, especially today. We wish him every success in his discussions later today. We all have to step up. We all have to be absolutely united. We've got to grow up, may I say, I think. We're talking about things that really we should be looking at other things now. We're at war. It's so very important for the world. Sorry.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We at Reform stand united with the whole of this House in support of Ukraine and all brave Ukrainians against the monstrous tyranny of that most evil, evil villain, Putin. We all also know, not even warming up, just make a little more progress. Just over 13 months ago, Madam Deputy Speaker, I donated to acquire a 4x4 pickup truck and to fill it with first aid, medical supplies and drive it with other volunteers to Ukraine and to give it to those brave soldiers on the front line. And I remember meeting the extraordinary technicians making the drones, including brilliant, bright children, helping to develop new drone technology. And tragically, sadly, I stood in a cemetery and watched the mums weep over the graves of their sons. And that cemetery now has almost doubled in size in just 12 months. So we all know that that maxim of peace through strength has always stood the test of time in history, today, and in the future. And that's why at the election, in our contract, we had 2.5% GDP on defence spending within 3 years and 3% within 6 years. And that's why we support the Prime Minister in his statements earlier this week in making those same commitments. And I hope that that 3% will be a firm commitment within some 5 or 6 years, because peace through strength is vital. And of course, as others have said, we all want peace, not least the brave Ukrainians. They want peace. And it must be right to try for a peace deal, however difficult. Most wars and conflicts do end up in some form of negotiation, however difficult, however tough, however tense. I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and given how he started his speech, I just wondered if he agreed with the leader of his party, the Honourable Member for Clacton, who is probably not in Clacton right now, when he said in 2014 that Vladimir Putin was the global leader that he most admired.
Honourable Lady for the statement. The issue is that Putin is a vile dictator. We all know that, and my leader has also confirmed that it is Putin that is the aggressor in this war. And I was just then moving on in the time allotted to the issue of how we get to a durable peace. Because I'm most grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. Happy to give.
I'm very grateful. I respect his personal position on this. But can he explain why the leader of his party thought that the priority for President Zelensky should be to set a timetable for elections when Winston Churchill, facing a dictator, didn't hold them because we were under martial law? Does he agree?
Well, the point about elections is a good one, because any peace deal can only work if it has the support and involvement of all Ukrainians. And of course, in the Second World War, we had elections in the summer of 1945 before the Second World War had ended. So that was completely appropriate then, and at some point the Ukrainians will need to be involved in supporting a peace deal if we get there. But a peace deal is only durable, it only works if it endures. And that means you have to have the security guarantees to ensure that the aggressor will never, ever, ever attack again. And those security guarantees is what we must focus on and all be involved in, and ensure that it is a strong, robust deterrent. And if we get those security guarantees right, then hopefully Putin and Russia will never, ever try this monstrous activity and invasion ever again.
David Burton-Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I too, like many of my honourable friends and members across the House, have just returned from Ukraine last night, the monstrous 24-hour journey, and I am mentally and physically exhausted after the experiences, and I can't sum up what I experienced in 5 minutes. I could talk about what I experienced for days. I really could. I want to thank my honourable friend for Leeds Central and Headingley and the UK Friends of Ukraine, and B4 NZ for the visit that they organised. It was truly just fantastic to be there, but also deeply emotional to be there. And I have nothing but respect and admiration for the Ukrainian people, their stoicism and the resolve in getting through this illegal war. They just keep functioning as though it's normal life. The buildings get bombed, and they don't just leave them crumbled on the ground, they rebuild them. The soldiers get injured on the front line, and they're in hospitals telling us they want to get back on the front line as soon as possible. This is the ingredients for a country that are set to take on Putin and set to win this war. I had experiences of 2 nights in an air raid shelter. First night with my honourable friends, and that night it was a little bit scary, but there was a sense of camaraderie between all of us in that shelter. I stayed on an extra night because I was heading up to Chernihiv the following day to meet the people up there. And that night I was in the shelter alone. And during that, you have a lot of time to reflect. You have a lot of time to reflect on what's going on outside that shelter. And the more the night went on, the more I became fearful, especially when I heard that there wasn't just drones out, there were missiles flying around above my head, potentially. The Ukrainians go through this every night, and they have been for 3 years now. There's a massive mental health issue developing, a massive PTSD issue developing with the Ukrainian citizens. And we need to be there and ready to support them when they come through this conflict, because it's going to be a really big issue for the country. Up in Chernihiv, I had a chance to meet with people who were basically on the front line of Belarus and Russia. And they are literally impacted by this war in ways you can't imagine every single day. I met with the governor, and he had some stats prepared in the presentation of how many buildings have been destroyed this year and how many people have been injured and how many have been killed. And he said to me, "Oh, I'm sorry, that statistic's wrong because another building was destroyed this morning and another 3 people were killed." Literally, it's changing constantly. But the greatest message I got from Ukraine and from the people of Ukraine is that they are incredibly, incredibly grateful for the support that the United Kingdom have given them since day one, and that they continue to give them today. They see us as the leader in the support to get them through this conflict. That came from so many Ukrainians. Look, this war is real. I witnessed that for myself, as did my honourable friends. There's bombed out buildings everywhere. There's air raids taking place. And what really brought it home to me was the day in Lviv, where Lviv isn't massively impacted, being close to the western border with Europe. But there was a cemetery that was full of soldiers just from Lviv. We walked to the back of that cemetery where there was 3 graves that had been filled in that morning, with 3 people from Lviv buried that morning. There were 3 further open graves that 3 further men from Lviv were about to go into that afternoon. That's the reality of this war. And that's why we have to continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian people. They are relying on us. We have to be stoic. Slava Ukraini.
Yeah. Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to start by paying tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, for providing us today with this platform to show this House at its best, coming together in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine, a chance for us to stand together in solidarity. Because, of course, 3 years ago, the world watched in horror as Russian forces launched their brutal, full-scale, illegal invasion of Ukraine. The images of tanks rolling across the border and the shelling of innocent civilians will remain seared in our minds forever. And yet, despite the Kremlin's relentless aggression, the Ukrainian people have shown extraordinary courage, determination and resilience, and we've shared some of those stories in here today. They continue to fight not just for their homeland, but for the principles that underpin our own security here: democracy, sovereignty and the rule of law. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've had the privilege of visiting Ukraine twice, first in 2021 during my time as Foreign Minister and again in 2023. And each visit left a very deep impression on me. In 2021, I had the honour of standing alongside Ukrainian leaders at the launch of the Crimea platform, reaffirming the UK's commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. When I returned in 2023 with the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and I must refer members to my register of interest as a board member, the contrast was so stark. I met parliamentarians, civil society leaders and local officials, many of whom had lost loved ones in the conflict. Their resilience was and still is unwavering. Their determination is undimmed. And it's their spirit, that must continue to guide us in this place in our response. And of course, the UK has led the way in supporting Ukraine. The previous Conservative government was among the first to provide advanced weaponry, including anti-tank missiles, long-range precision weapons and air defence systems. We played a key role in training Ukrainian troops and coordinating international military aid. So I welcome the government's commitment to £3 billion in annual military aid until the decade's end. But this support must continue to ensure Ukraine has the weapons and the strategic backing needed to defeat Russian aggression. Because, let us be clear, this is not just about helping Ukraine. This is about our own national security. Russia's actions represent the most blatant breach of sovereignty and territorial integrity seen in Europe since the Second World War. And if we falter in the face of this aggression, we invite further instability. We know that Putin's ambitions do not stop at Ukraine's borders. The threat that he poses to NATO allies, including in the Baltic region, is real and growing. That's why I welcome the government's decision to increase spending on defence to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. This is an important, albeit overdue step, and I commend the government for recognising, as my party does, that our security requires sustained investment. The war in Ukraine has also demonstrated the power of people-to-people solidarity, as my right honourable friend, the member for Romford and Chingford and Romford West, I might hopefully have got it right. Chingford and Wood Green, yes. I'm being prompted here.
People from Romford would be upset.
It would be, actually, yes.
Never present.
Always present, isn't it? The UK's Homes for Ukraine scheme has provided sanctuary to thousands of Ukrainians fleeing war, and I want to pay tribute to the British families, including those in my constituency who've opened their homes, and to the communities that have welcomed them with open arms. Their kindness reflects the very best of our country. And I would like to ask the Minister if perhaps the government would consider some sort of recognition scheme or some way of thanking these families at the appropriate time for their kindness and generosity. But this week, as we mark this very grim anniversary, we must ensure that those displaced by war continue to receive the support they need, both here and in Ukraine. We must remain resolute in holding Russia accountable, and our response must be unwavering, ensuring that we tackle all aspects of Russian aggression. Let's be clear, Ukraine's fight is our fight, and if we stand by them today, we strengthen our own security for the future. And if we falter, we embolden aggressors everywhere. Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as other members present have alluded to, a number of us were in Ukraine at the end of last week, and 4 days ago we were sat in a bomb shelter in Kyiv as the Ukrainian military worked to clear the sky of drones. We were in that city, a beautiful European city, one of the great cities of Europe, filled with a freedom-loving, well-educated population that is committed to liberating their country, a place no different from our own, as one of the 16-strong delegation to the Yalta European Strategy Conference. Never before in the history of that conference has that city come under bombardment while European parliamentarians were present. So great did Russia consider the risk of killing members of a NATO country. Something has changed, members, and we all know what it is. We need to wake up. For most of America's history, the country has been isolationist. After the First World War, they retreated back into isolationism. After the Second, they would have done so were it not for the Cold War. And since the end of the Cold War, were it not for the September 11th, which brought out George W. Bush back into the world, having been elected on a programme of isolationism, all three democratic presidents since the end of the Cold War have in part retreated back away from democratic affairs, from international affairs. This is the default status of America. We have to wake up to the realities of this. It's not about a single American president. This is about the future of Europe. It is about the fact that we can no longer rely upon an American security guarantee. And were we living in peaceful times, this would be worrying enough. but the fact is that Europe is at war. The arguments against appeasement have already been well made, and we know that if Ukraine falls, it would be a NATO country next, and in all possibility, a general nuclear war as part of Putin's quest to rebuild the Russian Empire. We must accept the reality that we are at war. A cold war, but a war nonetheless. Neutral countries do not attack UK infrastructure. Neutral countries do not test UK airspace and territorial waters. Neutral countries do not relieve nerve agents into the streets of Salisbury, or openly discuss in their papers, as they are doing now, the Americans have given them licence to bomb London. These are the actions of an enemy state. Since the announcement on Tuesday, which I greatly agree with, I have received correspondence from constituents expressing concerns to the cuts to international aid. I want to be frank with people. I believe that many, many more painful decisions will follow if we are going to do what is necessary to ensure the defence of our country, our defence against an enemy power. We must mobilise. With no American security guarantee, the only choice is a European security guarantee of which the UK must play a central role. For us, this will be a mobilisation not of men and women for the most part. If we must replace the total manpower of the US military, that number already exists within the Ukraine armed forces. 1 million in the American military, 1 million in the Ukraine military. They don't need the people. They're already on Europe's front lines, holding back the enemy. What they need from us is our combined economic and intellectual power across the continent, dedicated to our collective victory. Speaking with those in Ukraine, not only politicians, soldiers and analysts, but the everyday residents that we met along our travels, they are determined to go on fighting, however long it takes, alone if they must, hand to hand if totally necessary. We cannot allow things to come to that. 3 years into the conflict, why do the Ukrainians still want the bullets and shells? Why do they struggle to access sufficient electronic countermeasures? Why are we training soldiers in batches in the UK and have not set up colleges in Ukraine to train them en masse? If Putin was standing on the French coast, would we have not resolved this in months, if not weeks? We are at war. It is a war we can and must win. And if we are to do that, we must be prepared to do whatever it takes, starting today. Slava Ukraini.
Ollie Glover.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by paying tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for his outstanding and comprehensive speech. So many people have died in this war so far, Madam Deputy Speaker, and United Nations figures suggest 12,654 at least civilians have lost their lives and over 27,000 injured, with nearly 147,000 war crimes committed and 167,000 civilian buildings destroyed by Russia since this full-scale invasion began. But of course the true death toll is likely to be far higher, as Ukraine and international bodies do not have access to Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine or areas on the battlefront line, most particularly the city of Mariupol, which was largely destroyed in the brutal Russian siege. This is a tragedy which cannot continue, and yet, amidst so much darkness, a chink of light is how this war has shown the very best of our nation, our generosity towards Ukraine, how we have welcomed refugees and how we've worked internationally to get cooperation against Russia. In my constituency, Oxfordshire constituency of Didcot and Wantage, our district councils of Vale of Whitehorse and South Oxfordshire have gone a long way to welcome and help refugees and the many families who've hosted them, enabled by the Homes for Ukraine scheme. In the village of North Morton, with a population of just 350, they have hosted dozens of villages, earning significant media coverage for their generosity. In Brightwell-cum-Sotwell, similarly another small village, many families also have been hosted. And I just want to give an example of the journey of one of those families that they have faced. One family, a mother and 2 children, aged 17 and 6 when they came, had already fled from Donetsk in 2014 in the first Russian aggression against Ukraine, and then yet again in 2022 to the United Kingdom. The 17-year-old subsequently managed to get a place at Nottingham University and is looking forward to starting his studies, or has started his studies. The mother took her 6-year-old back to Ukraine last April, having missed her husband so much, and their host UK family are still in regular contact with her and her son. In Didcot, Stanislav of the Help Ukraine Group Support, or HUGS, has collected enormous amounts of materials such as clothing, toiletries, tools and many others, and sent huge pallets over to Ukraine. For example, in a shelter for displaced families called the Place of Kindness in Chernovsky, Ukraine. They reckon that has helped to shelter over 2,000 families, 147 orphans and 72 critically ill children. The same organisation collected and donated laptops to the Reading-based Ukrainian school Lastivka to enable children to get online and gain IT literacy. I want to say a little bit about why I care so much about the Ukraine war. Beyond the obvious reasons, I have a Polish mother, a country which also has hugely suffered under Russian oppression in the past and retains a genuine fear of that nation to this day. This war matters to Ukraine, it matters to Europe, but it also matters specifically for us. We hoped Russia would stop after its 2008 invasion of Georgia. It didn't. We hoped Russia would stop after annexing Crimea in 2014. It didn't. We hoped Russia would stop after years of war in the Donbass. It didn't. We hoped Russia would stop after its brutal bombing of Syria in support of dictator Bashar al-Assad in the late 2010s. It didn't. It is really important that we learn from that and ensure that any peace that we do have does not further embolden Russia. Where do we go from here? Well, firstly, our communities and councils need long-term support to continue hosting refugees and looking after Ukrainians, and many honourable members have already made very eloquent remarks on that. In terms of peace, yes, of course, we all want peace, but it has to be on Ukraine's terms. And, of course, there is so much talk at the moment of peace guarantees, and we should remember that supposedly there have been these before in the form of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for supposed guarantees of its peace. So we cannot have cheap talk of guarantees now. We need to learn why the past ones didn't work. And of course, we need European defence cooperation and investment in our armed forces. I hear many honourable members have been very optimistic in that the United States will not turn permanently in a direction away from Europe. But in case that optimism is misplaced, we do need to build up our defence forces and cooperate across Europe using those frozen Russian assets so that we have the high quality and competence defence force that our continent needs. In conclusion, this war has brought huge suffering to the people of Ukraine and destruction of its communities, separating families and orphaning children. But it has also showed the human spirit of justice, compassion and kindness as a great unifying force. We must now work with our European allies to secure the freedom and prosperity of Ukraine and our continent.
I call Dr. Jeevan Sander.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Keeping our nation safe, preserving Ukraine for the future means showing Putin that we and our European allies have the resolve and the resources to defeat him. Showing him that we win any war is the best way to prevent a wider conflict. And winning wars is a matter of resources and converting them to fighting forces. We lost the first battles of World War II, but we won by converting our greater resources. Lincoln did the same in the Civil War. So it is now. We must reduce Russian resources and prepare ourselves. Russia's economy is straining at the seams. Putin's demand for war material is outstripping the ability of his economy to supply it. The official inflation rate at 10%, possibly double. 3/4 of Russian firms facing staff shortages. Putin is losing tanks 3 times more quickly than he can replace them. His national wealth fund has halved. But Russia is still outproducing us in shells and fighting forces. Its armed forces will reach 1.5 million. And Russia can rebuild, and Putin will rebuild, and he will come back. So we can and must do more to reduce Russia's resources. Firstly, seizing those central bank assets rather than letting Putin using them to rebuild his own fighting forces. Secondly, strengthening the oil price cap by making London insurance for foreign ports dependent on the proper verification of attestation documents. And thirdly, stronger export controls to stop Western goods ending up in Russian tanks. That is what we can do right now. Deterring and defeating Putin is one and the same. Our economic power is greater. Our NATO's GDP in Europe is 12 times greater than Putin's in Russia. But our capacity to convert that economic power into fighting forces is what we must do next. Having prosperity means nothing if we do not have the forces to defend it. So yes, this is about the percentage we spend on defence, but it is about so much more than that as well. For Europe as a whole, long-term orders to build production capacity, securing the strategic inputs like steel, and the ability to scale rapidly if we must. And if we do face war, then we must be prepared for one. Fighting a total war, converting an entire nation's production into maximising fighting forces is a problem that none of us has ever known. But that could be the economic problem before us. It will change from maximising growth, from raising living standards, to maximising the production of war, of guns, of tanks, of drones. And the rough outline to the answer is this: figuring out national income, deciding the maximal proportion that can be allocated to war material production, using taxes from those who can best afford it, transferring to the government to what is needed. If demand runs ahead of supply, that will lead to inflation. So that means rationing consumption for more investment. Investment will have to go to war material. So capital controls will need to be in place. Import controls, quotas to ensure that inputs like steel are going to war material, and preparing for a financial world without lend-lease. Those are the preparations the Treasury should be making. We could not foresee the financial crisis. We could not foresee the pandemic, but we can foresee a greater war in Europe. These are the times in which we live. John Maynard Keynes, in the darkest days of our struggle against fascism, he wrote, "The reluctance to face the full magnitude of our task and overcome it is a coward's part. Yet the nation is not in this mood. It asks only what is necessary." That is where the British people are, a nation that remembers its finest hour. But where are we in this house? Are we preparing for the worst so we can prevent it? Are we showing that we will convert our far greater resources to protect Europe and ourselves? And are we ready to do what we must? That is the question before us. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. And before I call the next speaker, I am wanting to get everybody in that I possibly can. So I'm taking it down to an immediate 4-minute time limit, and it might go lower. Chris Coughlin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would like to thank the other honourable members who are on the visit to Ukraine for their powerful speeches. And I share your emotions about the visit. Last Saturday was particularly emotional for me because I visited a recovery centre in Ukraine for wounded soldiers. I met a soldier called Volodymyr who had lost both his legs in a drone strike on his vehicle. His comrades had tried to rescue him 4 times, but each time they were turned back by drone attacks. His tourniquets held, and after 9 hours, they eventually got him out. But his spirit was unbroken. Hearing his story and seeing his courage was inspiring. We in Parliament and the British Armed Forces have enormous respect for everything that the Ukrainian Armed Forces have achieved. Ukrainians continue to pay an enormous sacrifice. Yet every Ukrainian I met told me that they do not want Trump's proposed ceasefire. They want to fight on because they are fighting to win. And their choice to fight, and our choice to support their fight, is not warmongering. It is rather the choice to save lives. Because Putin breaks ceasefires. He'll regroup, attack again, and kill even more. The only acceptable terms are terms where Ukraine is victorious. Russia is vulnerable now. In the last 6 months, they have failed to retake their own territory in Kursk. They've lost over 200,000 casualties, advancing just 50 kilometres in eastern Ukraine, largely because Ukraine is outproducing them with drones. 4,000 casualties per kilometre. Ukraine has a clear path to victory. European NATO GDP alone is 10 times the size of Russia. But we are not converting that economic strength into military power. Russia is still spending $40 billion annually more on the war in Ukraine than Ukraine and her Western allies. If we could close and exceed that gap today by seizing the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets, then Ukraine will win. Now, Trump's proposed ceasefire would free up 750,000 battle-hardened Russian troops who could crash into the Baltic states and achieve Putin's dream of restoring the Soviet Union. It is far better to defeat Russia and Ukraine than end up directly at war. And we cannot trust Trump to defend Ukraine, and we cannot trust him to defend us, so we must rearm. And with Article 5 in doubt, the smaller democracies, including the United Kingdom and Ukraine, must consider a new Western alliance that is strong enough to defend ourselves together. Madam Deputy Speaker, it was particularly moving to see Volodymyr because his sacrifice is also on our behalf. In fact, many Ukrainians reminded me that they were comparing their sacrifice to our sacrifice in 1940, when it was our country's responsibility to defend democracy during our darkest hour. We would do well to remember that legacy now as we consider not just the fate of Ukraine, but the fate of the free world.
I call Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I say it's a pleasure to take part in such a well-informed and passionate debate in the Chamber today. And 3 years on from Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the courage of Ukrainian people, I know, is an inspiration for all of us. I was there at the Munich Security Conference as it felt like the world changed around us, and there are significant consequences that flow from that. It's clear that any settlement negotiated solely between Trump and Putin would not be a dignified and secure peace for Ukraine. As democratically elected President Zelensky has said, no peace in Ukraine without Ukraine, and no peace in Europe without Europe. European leaders, including our Prime Minister and our whole Parliament, rightfully stand in full solidarity with him. With a war machine in full swing, we know that Russia would not stop with Ukraine given the opportunity, and we must be clear that this is about security for the UK too. And our Prime Minister is doing vital work in Washington DC today with that in mind. The dramatic divergence of US and European approaches really matters, and we have to be clear about how many other countries now have an interest in Ukraine as well. 12,000 North Korean troops on the front line, Iranian drones being used, technology provided by China. We are not just up against Russia in Ukraine. This is about a group of states who are seeking to disrupt an already fractured global order. And so securing a just and lasting peace in Ukraine has become the defining test of who our allies are in the world and how far we're willing to go to defend the values of freedom, democracy and sovereignty that unite us. The The last 3 years have seen 2,236 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine, the most ever recorded by the WHO in a conflict. These have increased in the last year and now occur on an almost daily basis.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? Does she agree with me that when this conflict ends, one of the things we must examine very closely is the potential use of chemical weapons by Vladimir Putin during this conflict, as he has previously used in Syria and other conflicts, and as some of us on this trip has been discussed today also saw firsthand in the hospitals?
I absolutely agree, and accountability is essential. I was just about to say that Putin, more than a decade ago, tested the tactic of attacking hospitals in his operations in Syria, and the world stood by. And the message about impunity spread, and we've subsequently seen the same tactics used by other forces in Gaza and in Sudan, and of course now by Putin in Ukraine. Children should never be targeted in war, and the ICC has an arrest warrant out for Putin's deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. But the stability and prosperity that we have enjoyed in our part of the world for the last 80 years cannot be taken for granted. It was fought for, literally. Democracy doesn't just happen. You have to want it, value it, work to keep it and protect it, and we have much work to do in this regard. In my previous work in war zones across the world, I often returned home with the sense that conflict and disaster can happen anywhere. That is why we need to support our global institutions now more than ever. Institutions like the United Nations and the framework of international law put in place after World War II. If we value these achievements, we must uphold and protect them. And our government is absolutely right to increase defence spending and to do so rapidly. I've seen too many times as a former aid worker what happens when countries fail in their most basic duty to keep our country safe. Of course, funding this increase in defence funding through the aid budget is painful. And I say to those in the international development community in this country and elsewhere that I and others feel the pain. Given the scale of external threats, we should all understand that further painful decisions of a different kind may come in the future. I want to end by paying tribute to the Ukrainian refugees who I met in my constituency in Kirkcaldy a few weeks ago. We owe it to those refugees and to all who have fought for Ukraine, the UK and Europe's freedom to do whatever it takes now to defend our shared freedom and security.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start by thanking the Right Honourable Member from Chingford and Woodford Green for securing this debate. But I don't know about the image I'm going to have forever of him baking pizzas in the snow. But Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise today in support of the people of Ukraine. They have seen their nation invaded and devastated by bombing, their children kidnapped, their mothers and sisters raped, and many of their homes, hospitals and schools completely destroyed. In Leicester, like the rest of this country, we have a tradition of standing up for the oppressed, the bullied and the underdog. During World War II, RAF Leicester East, now Leicester Airport, was home to the US 82nd Airborne Division, who played a major role in D-Day and the liberation of Europe from the Nazis. Britain has showed its compassion since Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago, perfectly articulated by the Right Honourable Member for Gosport. The British people have stood firmly, resolutely beside the Ukrainian people, and I think one of the reasons for this is our nation's tradition of standing up for the underdog. Russia invaded Ukraine in the belief that Ukraine was weak and vulnerable. They would roll over and play dead whilst Putin took their land, identity and resources. But what he actually discovered was that Ukraine is an underdog that bites back, and the British people have wholeheartedly identified with their bulldog spirit. They have won our hearts and they have won our loyalty. Their determination to fight on, to protect their homes, their families and their culture has been really painful to watch. But any nation that can so effectively fight Putin's military might deserves our unwavering support and the support of our supposed allies. What may be even harder to watch in the coming months and years is the new world order that is being established. Is the UK and other European countries having to have to taste its own medicine of what many other small countries have experienced for generations. That is, a new world order where the largest powers decide to redraw the map or steal minerals or natural resources at the stroke of a pen while facing menacing threats or much worse if they don't comply. A new world order where those who have pardoned insurrectionists, who try to overturn a result of a democratic election, who to this day do not accept the results of the 2020 US elections, have the cheek to lecture long-standing European countries on the imperfect nature of their democracy. We must as a country stand against this new gangster world dominated by a few bros in ivory or even gold towers who trade the world's smaller nations between themselves like a property on a monopoly board. That is why, despite Ukraine's troubled past, their fight is our fight, and we must work with our European partners to make sure they win, regardless of the threats from Washington, Moscow, Pyongyang, or even Beijing. And who would have thought that those brave soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division stationed in Leicester, that their future president would align himself with today's equivalent of fascists rather than the nations and the people who fought to defeat that particular evil. When Ukraine wins, the new world order and that the few gangster bros are trying to establish will fail. That's why supporting Ukraine is so important and why European democracies have to step up and ensure they win. Thank you.
I call Jazz Atwell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I also thank the member for Chingford and Woodford Green for securing this debate. He spoke both powerfully, passionately and with knowledge. Madam Deputy Speaker, imperialism is violent and tragic, dividing communities, separating families and leading to untold death and destruction. This has been the grim reality for the Ukrainian people for the last 3 years. I witnessed this firsthand back in March 2022 when I travelled to the Ukrainian border with Romania to personally deliver essential items generously donated by the people of Ilford. The haunting scenes of women and children walking across the border into Romania with nothing but the clothes on their back at 4 a.m. in the morning with the temperature south of -10 degrees. I saw that whilst Putin's aggression has tried to shatter communities and sow division, the Ukrainian people have remained united and have shown incredible resilience, strength and perseverance. Like many of my constituents in Ilford South, I was born in India. My parents lived most of their lives in India and what is now Pakistan. My family, my neighbours, the people of Ilford South understand well the consequences of imperialism, the scars left by wars of aggression, theft of agency, denial of self-determination, which is why, when the invasion began, thousands of local people in Ilford stood with Ukraine and donated so much that we had to hire vans and appeal for additional drivers to get the donations to the border. This week's sombre anniversary is a reminder of suffering in Ukraine, the tragedy of imperialism, and the necessity of taking a stand, of doing what is right and confronting aggression head-on. On Monday, the Foreign Secretary announced the largest sanctions package against Russia since 2022. On Tuesday, the Prime Minister announced an unprecedented increase in defence spending, the biggest sustained increase since the end of the Cold War. We know the evils of imperialism. We've learnt from history that appeasing aggressors does not work. We will not stand by and allow the continued assault on a democratic nation. This House must remain united in its support for right over wrong. We will always stand with Ukraine. Thank you.
Josh Dean.
Mr. Speaker, it's intolerable that the violence and bloodshed of Putin's illegal invasion the waking nightmare of Russian aggression wrought upon the Ukrainian people has worn on for 3 ghastly years. At the weekend, I joined local residents, including the Ukrainian families who have found safe haven in our community, at a service of remembrance in Bishop Stortford, organised by the Bishop Stortford Ukrainian Guest Support Group. It was impossible not to be deeply moved as we stood for a minute's silence to remember all those who have lost their lives and suffered throughout this war, united in our shared hope that we will not have to meet again to mark a 4th year of violence in 2026. I want to pay tribute to all those in Hertford and Stortford who have shown their support for Ukrainian families in our community, and those who have gathered in recent days to pay tribute to the Ukrainian people, including in Bishop Stortford and Sawbridge Worth. It's a powerful reminder that in Hertford and Stortford, as across the country, we stand firmly with the Ukrainian people in their time of need. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Ukrainian people stand resolutely against Russian aggression and brutality, and our support for them must be unwavering. Now is the time to redouble our support for Ukraine. Successive British governments have led on this, the defining moral issue of our time, and our solidarity with Ukraine bridges political divides in this House. It is right that the Prime Minister now leads the international call for Ukrainian sovereignty, a long-term, secure future for its people, and a meaningful seat at the table in any future negotiation. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. I welcome the landmark 100-year partnership with Ukraine to deepen security ties and build an enduring partnership for future generations, and the action this government is taking to step up and speed up our support for Ukraine at this critical moment. But in a world more insecure, more unstable than at any time in recent decades, it is right that we do more to strengthen our security at home. It is right that the Prime Minister has announced an increase in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by April 2027. I recognise that this decision comes with difficult but necessary sacrifices, and I hope that in the coming years this government will chart a course to restoring spending on international aid as soon as fiscal circumstances allow, alongside increased defence spending. But this government's first priority must be to safeguard the British people at home in the face of what is a once-in-a-generation moment for the world. And I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's announcement this week. In closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to put on record my admiration for the spirit and bravery of the Ukrainian people who have endured so much, who will no doubt endure more, not just since 2022, but over the course of many years of unacceptable Russian aggression. And for those Ukrainian families who have found safety in our community, I hope for a future where they are free to choose to return to rebuild their homes in a peaceful, secure Ukraine, or, if they wish, to remain in Hertford and Stortford, where they will always, always be welcome.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I commend and thank the Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for setting the scene so very well, and for his passion for the subject. And all the years that I have known him in this chamber, and he's been here much longer than I have, but whenever I come in, he always was a stalwart. I thank him for that, because I think we all owe him a debt for that. I don't much like bullies, and quite clearly Putin's a bully. Now, there's a bigger boy in the playground, of course, with US President Trump entering the play. Putin seems prepared to make changes, and the rules are changing. Of course, this is to be welcomed. However, I have a real and abiding concern that memories will be deliberately short. A real concern that as we strive for peace, as we should, we will minimise the atrocities that the people of Ukraine have suffered over the space of these 3 years. And this cannot be allowed to happen. My mind is immediately drawn to Bucha, and whilst I have no desire to stir up anger or anguish either, there is a need to ensure that we remember who and what we're dealing with, and why it is essential that our support of Ukraine is as unwavering today during any brokerage of peace as much as it was during the first few days of that war. Human Rights Watch researchers who worked in Bucha from the April the 4th to the 10th, just days after Russian forces withdrew from the area, found extensive evidence of summary executions, other unlawful killings, enforced disappearances and torture, all of which would constitute war crimes and potential crimes against humanity. Those who sanctioned this behaviour are those who we deal with now, and I believe this must remain in our minds. We need accountability, that those who carried out atrocities will be made responsible for their brutality. Girls as young as 8 and women as old as 80 raped and abused. Russians' crimes against humanity must be taken to the international court, and those responsible made accountable in whatever way it can. If only the death penalty was still here, I would certainly seek that for them. In Northern Ireland, we dealt with the bare face of evil for too many years. We saw that hatred overcame basic humanity, as we saw mothers and children blown to pieces in a fish shop on a Saturday afternoon by Irish Republican terrorists whose no cause can justify this. We saw the face of evil when people were burned alive with napalm-like substance as they were at a restaurant in Le Mans in my constituency. We saw the face of evil when people in churches were massacred. All of this reminds me very much of the atrocities that the people of Ukraine have suffered as I look back at these last 3 years. I lived through those things in my lifetime, and they remain with me, and it grieves me that this face of evil is still at work, and these atrocities and disregard for human life, for women, for children, have been replicated in Ukraine. They've been replicated in Busha, as women and children were murdered. In February, as the body of a Ukrainian Orthodox priest was found in the streets of Kalanichak in Russian-occupied Kherson. According to the bishop, Russian military forces had tortured Father Stefan to death. That's the Russians, and it's about accountability for the brutality that they do. I see it as we hear of these kinds of evil deeds being repeated throughout Ukraine. Again, Madam Deputy Speaker, my intention is not to drag up these matters to cease to strive for peace. I believe peace is needed, but I also believe that accountability is needed, and that whilst we work for peace, we cannot allow the trauma of this war to fade into insignificance. These crimes matter, and those families who do not deserve to be forgotten. As we approach the 3rd anniversary of this dreadful war, my thoughts are as they ever were, that we stand with Ukraine, and we must fulfil our moral duty to them in a war or indeed in peace. And there must be no doubt that the hand of friendship of this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland remains firmly extended to those families in Ukraine at this time and in all the days ahead. Thank you.
Graham Downey.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A pile of dark brown mud next to a hole in the ground, a hole framed by planks of wood covered tightly in smooth, matte black sheeting. 4 rough wooden handles jammed in as the mud hardens around them, with invisible silver shovels buried beneath. A pile of mud and 4 shovels in the sharp, harsh, dry cold of Lviv. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is the image I've had in my mind for every waking minute of every day since Saturday morning. It is the picture of a newly dug grave in the Cemetery of Heroes in Lviv, Ukraine, as mentioned earlier on by my honourable friend for Southend West and Leigh. For me, this image encapsulated the 4-day trip which myself and other MPs from across this House returned earlier on this week. It may sound an unusual thing to say, but this graveside was not simply one of sorrow, nor just of pride, nor just of memory. It was one of defiance, it was one of resolve. And that image encapsulates for me the emotions of all of the people of Ukraine. They have taken the punishment dished out by a criminal, dictator, bully for 3 years. They have not only withstood the daily bombardments, they have thrived underneath their air defence umbrella. In a position where every day represents a struggle for survival to the next, Ukraine has not only been able to fight and reach the next day, but they have planned for a prosperous future. In health, education, technology, cybersecurity, scaling of innovation and in culture, the Ukrainian people are shaping their long-term future even as they take to shelters every night. This is not just keep calm and carry on. This is keep calm, win the present and build the future. The Ukrainian people want peace. Of course they do, but they will not accept peace at any price. We asked over and over again, what message do you want us to deliver back to our country, to our Parliament? And the answer was always this: something so simple and so obvious it is hard to believe it has to be restated. Russia has conducted an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine is the victim. We have had 20 years of warnings, from the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 to the first invasions of Ukraine and the public poisonings in Salisbury, and then finally the full-scale invasion of our ally. I'm happy to give way to my friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I wonder if he agrees with me that it is exactly because of Putin and Russia's past behaviour and seeming to sign up to agreements and then not doing so that security guarantees for Ukraine in the future are so important.
Can I thank my honourable friend for that intervention? I couldn't agree with her more. As someone who grew up in Berlin during the Cold War, where I could hear Russian artillery practice and Russian helicopters practicing on a live fire range, that is something which has always been present since I was very young. And we must not misunderstand the gravity of this moment. Geopolitical stability and security will be the defining issue for this generation and for this Parliament. It is incumbent on us to do whatever it takes to keep British people safe at home and abroad and to support our allies. And that is why I fully welcome and endorse the decision this week by the Prime Minister around defence spending increases. But as I argued in this House in December last year, 2.5% and even 3% should be seen as a floor for our defence spending, not the ceiling. This government has already taken one difficult decision, and there may well be more in the future. I suspect before very long the government may conclude it must go even further or even faster or both, and if they do so, they will have my full and total support. That is not to crave this spending, but to accept the reality of the world that we live in, not the world as we would wish it to be. And while the public clearly support the increased spending on defence, it is incumbent on all of us in this House to ensure that the reality of the danger and threat this country faces is brought home and what this might mean for tougher decisions in the future. While a war in Ukraine might feel abstract, as I saw over the past few days, that war can come very quickly to these shores in a variety of different ways. The mission of all sides of this House is to maintain that unity and to communicate that reality and bring the public with us on a long-term journey that will be difficult. With the 100-year partnership agreement signed by this government, we have the foundation for a long-term relationship with a country with whom we share so much and with whom we are standing shoulder to shoulder. And on that foundation, we can build a lasting peace. I want to end, Madam Deputy Speaker, with a quote by JFK. In the same speech in which he called for peace not merely in our time but for all time, he said, "There is no single simple key to peace, no grand or magic formula. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations and the sum of many acts." Ukraine has taken several of those many acts, and the UK is one of many nations. It is incumbent on us to continue acting until we find the peace we all seek.
I call Andrew Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Ukraine is a country that never sought war. As we speak today in this House, people who were once administrators, chefs, mechanics are sacrificing their lives on the front lines to protect their homes and families. And I just want to say what a privilege it has been to be in this chamber today, to hear some of the speeches from honourable members who have been in Ukraine over the last week and have told their stories so powerfully. Thank you for doing that. The people of Ukraine have, over the last 3 years, defied the odds at every turn and have a president unmatched in his bravery. President Zelensky looked down a smartphone in February 2022, stared down Putin's war machine and pledged to defend the right of his sovereign country to exist and the right of his people to be free, and he has done so ever since. Successive Prime Ministers have stood at that dispatch box and been absolutely right to offer British military and financial aid. The fight to protect Ukraine is a fight for democracy and for our shared values. And for 3 years, this cause has bound together Europe, the United Kingdom and the United States. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no doubt we have reached a crossroads, a moment in time that will shape the future of Ukraine and Europe. On the 14th of February, the Vice President of the United States made his keynote address at the Munich conference. He said, "The threat that I worry about the most vis-à-vis Europe is not Russia. What I worry about is the threat from within. the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values. It was a very sad and serious spectacle. A US Vice President seeming to downplay the significance of Putin's aggression in Europe. Aggression, which we've heard today, has led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people and millions more driven from their homes. If his primary concern really is freedom of speech and expression, he would do well to look closer to home. Just this week, journalists from Reuters and the Huffington Post were denied access to the first cabinet meeting of the US administration. Madam Deputy Speaker, what I worry about is an agenda that claims to champion free speech, but is actually seeking to promote favourable speech. Those are two very different concepts. The words of the Vice President served as confirmation that a period of US history is ending. The Republican Party of Eisenhower and Reagan is sleeping. It may well wake again in time, but for now it lies dormant. So in Kyiv, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, and here in London, we have to respond to the world as it now is. A peace deal fully supported by the United States and Ukraine and Europe must of course remain the central objective, and our Prime Minister is absolutely right to pursue it. But as the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green told the House, a deal cannot just mean the absence of war. Peace is what the people of Ukraine deserve, but we must never countenance a settlement that is not agreed to by President Zelensky. Returning to Munich, there was one sentence in the speech of Vice President Vance that I could endorse. He said, to believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. On that, he is right. Our citizens do have wisdom. In the United Kingdom, they have the wisdom to look to the history of our continent, to see the danger of failing to stand up to aggressors until it's too late. They know that now is the time to make our voices heard, to say loudly and in unison that we stand with Ukraine.
I call David Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for calling this debate, and for his bravery, I should say, of actually going as far as Kharkiv, and I admire the work and advocacy he's been doing. In the time that we have left, I just want to associate myself with everything that people have said. Of course, especially with the bravery of the people of Ukraine, the men and women who are every day standing up to Putin and fighting, not just for their own freedom, but for our freedom. I, myself, and the Honourable Member for Bolton West have just come back from a week in Ukraine where we had an opportunity to speak to a number of MPs, ministers, industry leaders and civil society. And I want to focus my remarks in this debate on the need for drone technology, because I think that is absolutely paramount to us winning in Ukraine. I know that many people have spoken about this. It really is an existential crisis that we're facing here, and that's why the need to increase defence spending to 2.5% is so important, and the need to get beyond that to 3% and beyond is also vital too. It's clear from that trip last week, and it was clear in my previous visit, that Putin is not going to stop at Ukraine's borders. If Ukraine falls, then NATO countries, the Baltic countries in particular, are in the firing line, and that is why it is so important that constituents in my constituency and elsewhere do understand that this is not a war about other people, it is also a war about us as well. But as I said, I just wanted to focus on the point about drone technology, because in a meeting with Deputy Defence Minister Sergei Boyev, I was told that Ukraine needs a fleet of drones that possess the same characteristics as a Kalashnikov. Now, what he meant by that, and what this was reflected back to me by the head of the Economics Affairs Committee, Dmytro Nachalushka MP, which I know others in this House have met as well. What he meant was something like a Kalashnikov, a flying Kalashnikov, if you will, that is the standard issue, has an ease of manufacture, is reliant on available common parts, and is comparatively cheap. Now, that isn't alone going to match the existential crisis we all face, but I do think it could play a vital role in this war. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, in order to get that, the drone sector needs to be able to access UK capital, and we do need more joint ventures between our defence companies in the UK and Ukrainian defence companies as well. I just want to underline why these drones are so important, because there are many different types of drones now, and of course there are the massive ones like the Iranians are unfortunately supplying to Putin's forces, like the Shahid drones. When I was in Ukraine, I was also spending time in a bunker because there was at one point 50 Shahid drones overhead. But actually, I want to talk instead about some of the drones that are necessary just to hold the Ukrainian positions and to help them to advance. Because in the words of the security advisor and expert James Rushton, who I had an opportunity to meet whilst I was out there, small recon drones like the DJI Mavic are the difference between an entire platoon of Ukrainian troops surviving or not. They can help them know that the Russians are coming in the horizon and get out of there in good point. And of course, the converse is true. They can also help them to hold positions, but also to advance as well. So I do think that it's absolutely important that we get to a place where we're able to provide more capital to Ukrainian companies, that we're able to help them with the parts that they need. And collectively, European allies as well are able to help them produce some standard and cheaper types of drones, because I do think they're going to be vital in this war. Thank you.
I call Oliver Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green and others for securing this debate, which I was proud to also be a co-sponsor. So many excellent and learned points have been made. I think it's been a real show of unity in the House, and I think we can all be proud of the debate today. 3 years ago, peace was broken. The world woke up to something we hope we'd never see again. Full-scale war in our backyard. Russian tanks rolling into Europe, across Ukraine's borders. Missiles lighting up the sky, the fire of war ripping through homes. Complete and utter destruction of harmony and innocence. People grabbing whatever they could and fleeing for their lives. Russian forces had brutally invaded their sovereign neighbour. Putin, the dictator, thought this would be over in weeks, yet because of the tenacity, the fight, the bravery, the leadership of Ukraine and Zelensky, 3 years on, here we are. Today, Ukraine is still fighting, not just for its land, but for its survival. It's been said many times before, but I'll say it again. If Russia stops, this war is over. If Ukraine stops, they lose everything. Yeah. And so today, before anything else, we pause to honour those who've paid the highest price, the parents who've buried their children, the soldiers who've kissed their loved ones goodbye, not knowing if they'd ever return, the civilians who once lived in peaceful villages, now reduced to rubble. Millions have been displaced, hundreds of thousands have been killed, schools, hospitals have been destroyed in targeted ballistic missile strikes, among other acts of terror and war. People have endured torture, execution, sexual violence, had their children snatched and sent to Russia, and horrors and atrocities we here in Britain struggle to even imagine, never mind put into words. And yet, despite all this, the flame of hope for a free nation, Ukraine, stands, not just stands, fights, and refuses to surrender, refuses to be a footnote in the history of this brutal expansionism of that barbaric, mad tyrant in Moscow. We all like to think that in that scenario we would do the same, that we kiss our loved ones goodbye and fight for our country, our families and our way of life. The Ukrainians have been doing that now for 3 years, through smoke and rubble and fire and attack after attack after attack. They have stood up and said to Putin, not us, not Ukraine. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is in honour of that bravery, that spirit, that flame of hope that we must proclaim. To not an inch of Ukraine is Russia entitled. Not a metre of Ukraine belongs to Russia. Not a mile of Ukraine is Russia's sphere of influence by divine right. That air, that soil, those people, those children are Ukrainian, and we stand with them today and every day for democracy, for freedom, for sovereignty, decency, for the world that we want to believe in. No surrender, no appeasement, no deals without Ukraine at the table. We will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. Slava Ukraini.
Lawrence Turner.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank all the members of the Backbench Business Committee and the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for granting and leading this debate. 3 years ago, we watched as missiles rained down on Ukraine from Kharkiv to Lviv, damaging even the Holocaust memorial at Babin Yar, and I think anyone who has stood in that space will share the sense of revulsion at that desecration. A motorised column reported to be some 40 miles in length advanced on Kyiv, and its advance groups left a horror of murder in their wake. This was a terrible return of unrestricted industrial warfare to Europe for the first time since 1945, and the goal must be bluntly stated. The Russian state seeks the destruction of Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian national identity, and the proof of that assertion can be found in the borders that were laid out in Izum, in Bucha, in Kherson, and I fear in many places more, the names of which are not known to us, which only liberation could identify. Madam Deputy Speaker, when we think back to February 2022, we must remember also the hope that could quickly be found among despair. A small Ukrainian force defeated the Russians at Hostomel Airport, and on such a fine margin, the nation may have been saved. And the actions of successive UK governments and the unity of this House has, as many of us have said, been essential to that Ukrainian struggle for liberty. Out of war has come new bonds of family and friendship, and I would like to pay tribute to the members of the British Armed Forces who have trained Ukrainians, and also the Royal Centre for Defence Medicine at Birmingham. They have learned from us, and as was said earlier, we have learned from them. And all those who have acted as hosts and part of a wider support network for Ukrainian refugees. One of the most valuable things I think we can do in this place is to repeat Ukrainian voices, and I should like to quote one, Ivana Krakro, Youth Chair of the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine, who it was my pleasure to come to know over the last couple of years, who said this ahead of a TUC vote some 18 months ago. Of course we want peace, more than anything, but we want a just peace without occupiers in our country. And as Alexandra Matvichuk, the head of the Centre for Civil Liberties in Ukraine, which holds the Nobel Peace Prize, said, peace cannot be reached by a country under attack, laying down its arms. That would not be peace, but occupation. And I hope that message, so eloquently articulated by Ukrainians who know the Russian regime better than anyone, is heard by all those currently making decisions about Ukraine's future. Now, in the very short time available, I do not have time to go into detail, but I would just like to say that the issues identified by the Honourable Member for Chichester in regards to the Ukraine Permission Extension Scheme have been heard in my constituency as well, and I hope that ministers are monitoring those concerns closely. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to close by just echoing one last Ukrainian voice, which is that of Taras Shevchenko, who, writing in his poem almost 200 years ago, also under Russian occupation, said this, and the words ring true today. "O bury me, then rise you up and break your heavy chains, and water with the tyrant's blood the freedom you have gained. And in that great new family, the family of the free, with softly spoken kindly word, remember also me." If one message is to go from this House today, I hope it is this: our nation's support for the Ukrainian cause is constant, not passing. We remember Ukraine, and we will stand with Ukraine and our Ukrainian friends to the end, to the very end, and the hoped for day, as hard as the path may now be, as hard as it now may be to imagine, to that hoped for day when all Ukraine will be free.
In the short period of time I've got left, I will say this. We face a critical moment for our nation, for Europe and the world. Now is the time to uphold our values and encourage our allies to do the same. It means concrete steps here and now to protect and defend Ukraine, as well as lasting agreements to ensure their security into the future. And while it feels like a dark phase for European security, it isn't the first time that we who believe in cooperation and the importance of alliances have had to argue the case with those who favour a more transactional, zero-sum approach to international relations. We must hearten ourselves that we have won the argument before, including with our American friends, and we must appeal to the noblest instincts of that great nation. We are now at a hinge in history, perhaps the most dangerous one since the Cold War, because what is at stake is not just the erasure of a nation, but also the weakening of the international rules-based system and the transatlantic military alliance which has in combination underpinned European security since World War II. Even the concept of truth is being challenged, but I won't rehearse those points. We all know that there is a truth and we must defend it. We must not allow great powers to trade Ukraine's future like a pawn in a game of chess, because what is at stake is the principle that bullies must not prosper in our world. For if they do, other nations will be next. Indeed, the former British Prime Minister, whose bust sits in the Oval Office, once said, "Appeasement is feeding the crocodile, hoping he will eat you last," and the Baltic states understand this. Yeah. So I strongly welcome the leadership that the Prime Minister has shown in reasserting our values and our commitment to increase defence spending and to contemplate putting peacekeeping troops on the ground. We must defend the right of any country to defend itself against invasion by its neighbour. But Ukraine isn't just any country. It is a beacon for those who value freedom. In their bravery and sacrifice, they're upholding the concept not just of their own, but of every nation's sovereignty. They are defending the international rules-based system, international law, freedom, democracy, human rights, and yes, they're defending us. We must remind our friends around the world that intelligent self-interest and upholding moral values are synonymous. And if we do this, Ukraine will live on, the rules-based system will live on, and ultimately a world in which values and defends freedom and democracy against those who threaten them will live on.
Now call Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst I welcome the opportunity to speak in the debate today, it's one that we all hoped we would never have to have. And I thank the member for Woodford and Chingford for securing this debate. For over 3 years, the brave people of Ukraine have heroically defended their country against a full-scale invasion, defying Putin's expectations and showing the world their courage, resilience and unwavering determination. They've reminded us all of what is at stake, the right of a sovereign nation to choose its own destiny, free from coercion and tyranny. Today, we are at a pivotal moment with our Prime Minister in the US. This is a moment that will determine the future of our continent for generations to come. Now, more than ever, we must stand firmly in support of our Ukrainian friends, resist Trump's dangerous flirtation with a deal that rewards Russian aggression, and work with our European allies to defend freedom and democracy. The UK must act decisively, and that starts with working with our European allies to unleash the £40 billion worth of Russian assets currently sitting idle in banks, to give Ukraine a critical boost at this critical moment. The UN General Assembly has recognised Russia's obligation to make reparations to this illegal war, yet history shows us that Russia will never voluntarily pay for these reparations. By redirecting these funds to Ukraine, we are not undermining the rule of law, we are upholding it. Some fear that seizing these assets sets a dangerous precedent. I argue the opposite. It sets a necessary precedent. It tells the world that the international community will act decisively against those who wage unprovoked wars of aggression. It is only right that these assets are repurposed for military aid, humanitarian support and rebuilding efforts. Any negotiations about Ukraine's security must involve Ukraine itself. This war is about their sovereignty. Its fate cannot be decided in backroom deals between Washington and Moscow. I cautiously welcome reports that the White House is engaging respectively with Kyiv, but this commitment must extend beyond words. There can be no ceasefire or security negotiations without Ukraine at the table. Anything less would be an insult to the sacrifices made by its people and a betrayal of the values we claim to uphold. Supporting Ukraine means more than military aid alone. It requires long-term investment in defence, manufacturing, joint procurement with Ukrainian companies, and a recognition that Ukraine's innovation in defence technology, robotics, AI and prosthetics is unparalleled globally. The UK should actively support and invest in these sectors while helping to strengthen Ukraine's economy, while also bolstering our own security and technological capabilities. We must also stand with Ukrainian veterans and refugees. More than 250,000 Ukrainians now call the UK home. Many of those arrived here in 2022 will now soon need to apply for visa extensions under the Ukraine Permissions Extension Scheme. And while this grants them an 18-month extension, it provides no certainty for their long-term future. we must ensure that Ukrainians in the UK have clarity about their right to remain, while understanding that so many of them will return to their country once the war is over. If the US retreats from its role in global security, Europe must step up, and Britain should lead. While the government's pledge to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 is welcome, we hope this will mean a reversal of the Conservative Party's short-sighted 10,000 troop cuts, but we must go further. Given the increasingly volatile global landscape, the UK needs to plan to increase defence spending further again. Now is not the time to play politics. The government should recognise this and host cross-party talks to discuss a pathway to 3% as soon as possible. However, we must fund this in the right way. At a time when Ukraine's economy is contracted by nearly 30% and its reconstruction needs are estimated at nearly $500 billion, it is incomprehensible that the UK has chosen to cut its international aid budget to fund the increase to defence. Slashing funding for global development while increasing defence spending is like robbing Peter to pay Paul. The UK's soft power is a vital tool in this fight, and we must restore our aid budget to 0.7% of gross national income, ensuring that our support for Ukraine is not at the cost of abandoning other vulnerable nations. Defence, after all, is based on defence, diplomacy and development. The Liberal Democrats have set out how to increase defence spending, how it could be fairly funded by increasing taxes on social media firms and other tech giants. The government, however, has chosen to finance it by cutting the international aid budget. This is a dangerous mistake. Weakening the UK's global influence will only play into the hands of Russia and China. We must also lead discussions into the creation of a European rearmament bank, led by the UK and other like-minded European NATO allies. It would allow us to collectively increase defence spending further and faster by raising additional private capital. This model would mean a more stable long-term financing system, enabling the defence industry to innovate and increase production capacity. The question is not whether we act, but what happens if we do not. Failing to stand with Ukraine will embolden Putin, undermine NATO and threaten European security. 3 years into this war, the stakes could not be higher. We must take bold action to stand up for democracy, for our allies in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and for our own security. Thank you.
I call Shadow Minister James Cartledge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to have the opportunity to mark the grim milestone that is the 3rd anniversary of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and I'm grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for calling this debate and pay tribute to all the brilliant speeches on both sides of the House we've heard, but particularly from my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. But above all, Madam Deputy Speaker, I pay tribute to the people of Ukraine. Without any provocation whatsoever, Ukraine has suffered vast casualties and a national trauma beyond our wildest imaginings, all forced on it by an aggressive dictator and a bully. For if we ask ourselves the question of why this war has happened, surely Lord Acton famously had the explanation back in 1887. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There is a reason that Putin is able to murder on our streets, threaten nuclear war, harass our maritime and airspace, invade free nations, do away with his political opponents, and care not a jot for a casualty rate of his own forces of over 1,000 a day. And that is because he is not constrained by the checks and balances of a democracy to hold him to account. He has absolute power and has used it destructively, regardless of the impact on his own people, let alone on the people of Ukraine. And so Putin's motive is one we have seen from despots down the centuries: power lust and hunger for conquest, like so many dictators before him, externalising his nation's problems, which his corrupt oligarchy can never satisfy, but ultimately leading to internal economic hardship and pain for all, bar him and his close elite. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am incredibly proud of the support we gave in government to Ukraine, providing the weapons to help it avoid an early capitulation, which would have been truly disastrous for Ukraine and the free world. And as the opposition, we've continued to stand resolutely with Ukraine, supporting the Labour government to that end, as they did with us prior to the July election. And so we wish the Prime Minister every success in Washington and hope for a lasting peace, where Ukraine can finally enjoy the security it deserves. But for all the talk of peace, for all our efforts to date providing everything from tanks to Storm Shadow missiles, and despite the incredible bravery of Ukraine's armed forces in defying the odds to push back Putin's land and naval forces, The day-to-day reality in Ukraine is one of continued bombing and pain and suffering for its people. So a key question for us in this debate is what action this day can we undertake to support the ongoing fight? And I'm going to turn to the subject raised by the Honourable Jennifer Hemel-Hempstead in an excellent speech, raising the issue of drones and rearmament, because there is one aspect to the rearmament potential which I believe speaks to our own need to rearm and the fact that Ukraine will need a far greater scale of rearmament, whether a settlement is achieved or not. Without one, the ongoing war requires it. With a settlement, the need to give Ukraine security about its future will also require a continued ramp-up of military industrial production, not least to deter Russia. As such, now that the government has confirmed its plan for a sustained increase in defence spending, we must urgently unlock our domestic procurement to drive both our own defence industrial capacity and that of Ukraine. On Monday, I had the pleasure to visit a brilliant UK defence SME, Medini, creating one-way attack drones and other capabilities for the British Army. When I launched the MOD's first ever defence drone strategy about a year ago, the plan was to procure drones at scale for Ukraine, as we have done, and learn from that to build a domestic industry capable of arming our own military. So it was frustrating to hear from Medini what I've heard from so many of our best defence SMEs, that procurement is largely on hold, and en masse, our fantastic firms are like a coiled spring waiting for the government to press go on procurement at the scale and pace we've needed for months. So like the Honourable Lady for the Lib Dems, I believe that a big step forward would be for our defence companies to urgently forge new joint lines of production with Ukrainian firms in the United Kingdom, honouring the promise of Pillar 1 of the 100-year partnership to, and I quote, establish stronger and closer defence cooperation and industrial bases. Why is this so important? Because Ukrainian defence companies that I've spoken to want UK production for safety reasons away from the bombing. But also they know that by partnering with UK SMEs, this will provide access to capital and ultimately a chance to feed into UK procurement. For the UK, this means access to the know-how and expertise of those companies who have manufactured capabilities that have actually succeeded in a war as it is being fought this very day. For our armed forces in the MOD, it means realising the cultural change we need to see, being less risk-averse in procurement and rapidly developing capability to enhance the lethality and survivability of our armed forces in the near term, which will be particularly important should there be a peacekeeping force. Madam Deputy Speaker, ultimately, conventional war that is sustained for a longer period is fought in terms of factory production capacity linked to innovation. And I don't agree with the Honourable Gentleman for Loughborough about capital controls. I think there's enough capital. But he made an excellent speech about the need to boost capacity. And something I was looking at as Minister for Defence Procurement was multilateral procurement with NATO partners. Because whatever its current military capabilities, Europe has a vast industrial base that could scale up with the willpower to do so and leadership from governments. So I conclude, we led at the outset of the war. And with our greatest ally, the US, reasonably asking us and our NATO allies to do more of the heavy lifting confronting the Russian threat, we will need to lead again. That requires leadership on industry and innovation in the UK and across Europe, to massively boost our defence industrial capacity, and I would urge the Minister to do everything possible to accelerate partnerships with those Ukrainian businesses that have delivered on the front line, but will be even stronger with British backing, creating British jobs to deliver a far greater scale of production but for both of our armed forces. We can and must continue to do everything possible to support Ukraine.
Yeah.
Minister Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm in particular grateful for the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for initiating this timely debate, which is an honour to close. And I'm grateful for all the superb contributions, Madam Deputy Speaker, on both sides of the House. I think I'm especially grateful for the powerful advocacy for those members who have just returned from Ukraine, to share their experiences of what is going on in Ukraine and telling the story of the brutality of the Russian onslaught. I've been in a bomb shelter in Kyiv as the air raid sirens sound. It's a sobering experience. It's one that stays with you, and it must. And it's a reminder of the daily courage of our Ukrainian friends as they resist Putin's illegal invasion. Today we've had the opportunity to reflect on the most unhappy of anniversaries. 3 years this week since Putin's illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 3 years in which thousands of people have lost their lives. Millions of Ukrainian families have seen their homes and communities destroyed. Ukrainian children stolen by Russia. And although Russian troops continue to make small territorial gains, both nations have become deadlocked in a war of attrition. But this was a war that Putin believed he could win in 3 days. Thanks to the extraordinary resistance and courage of Ukraine, Russia has been humbled on the battlefield. 3 days have turned into 3 years, and today is 1,099 days. Go on, quickly.
Very quickly. The whole House will recall that when Russian tanks were bearing down on Kyiv, President Zelensky was offered a ride out for his own personal safety. He famously replied, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." That was Churchillian heroism, wasn't it?
I think all parties in this House have rightfully praised President Zelensky, the democratically elected leader of Ukraine. It is right that we continue to stand with him and his people for as long as it takes. And that's what I will come on to in these remarks. Putin's resources have been drastically worn down, with over 860,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded. The UK government expects the grim milestone of 1 million Russian casualties to be achieved in the coming months. Nearly 4,000 main battle tanks, 8,400 armoured vehicles have been lost, and the damage and destruction of the once formidable Black Sea Fleet is testament to what a nation without a navy can now do with the right equipment and approach. But let's not forget, over 3 years, the UK has often been the first to step up to help Ukraine. This year, we will spend £4.5 billion on military assistance, more than ever before. To date, the UK has provided £12.8 billion of support, as well as training over 51,000 Ukrainian personnel with our allies as part of Operation Interflex. And we have committed £3 billion a year for as long as it takes in military support. We have continued to strengthen Ukraine in recent weeks. Earlier this month, we announced a new £150 million firepower package, including drones, tanks and air defence systems. On Monday, the Defence Secretary announced we are doubling our support to Ukraine's life-saving defence medical services with a £20 million uplift in funding for Project Renovator. The UK has been repairing and upgrading a military rehabilitation hospital in Ukraine and providing training to Ukrainian surgeons, doctors and nurses, and this funding will provide a major boost for this project. It will help Ukrainian soldiers recover from frontline service and help those who have suffered life-changing injuries defending Ukraine's sovereignty. Also on Monday, we heard from the Home Secretary how we are turning the tables on Putin by blocking Russian elites and oligarchs from entering the UK. And the Foreign Secretary announced the largest package of sanctions since the early days of the conflict, which aim to hit Russia's revenue and hamper Vladimir Putin's military machine. Standing alongside our allies, we will do what's necessary to support Ukraine and keep Europe and Britain safe. The UK is solidifying our historic 100-year partnership with Ukraine, signed by the Prime Minister and President Zelensky in Kyiv in January, bolstering cooperation on defence and security and more, and importantly, signalling our confidence that in 100 years' time, there will still be a free and sovereign Ukraine. I now turn to some of the important questions that have been raised in today's debates. On negotiations, while Russia is weakened, it remains a significant military threat, not just to Ukraine, but to the whole of Europe and the United Kingdom as well. Ukraine is the front line of freedom, and our defence and security begins on that front line in eastern Ukraine. That's why the decisions made in negotiations over the coming weeks and months will not only define the outcome of this conflict, but also the shape of European and global security for decades to come. Everyone wants this war to end, none more so than the Ukrainian people. They need a chance to rebuild their shattered nation. So the efforts by President Trump's administration to find a solution to the crisis are welcome. But the resulting peace cannot be achieved at any price. That would be an insult to Ukraine, whose armed forces continue to fight with enormous courage and skill, and whose population continues to endure unimaginable hardships. When the fighting stops, it must be followed by a strong, stable, durable, lasting peace. That means a deal that safeguards Ukraine's sovereignty, an end to Russian aggression, not a temporary ceasefire before Putin finds an excuse to return to violence, a lasting, durable peace, because an insecure peace risks more war, and a US backstop is the only way to achieve a durable and lasting peace. The government's position is clear. Negotiations about Ukraine cannot happen without Ukraine. At the same time, it is right that the UK and Europe plays our part in securing the peace. It is our security that is being negotiated as well as Ukraine's. We have to work together with the US to achieve a sustained peace and protect the democracy that both the US and Europe hold so dear. That's why the Prime Minister has said that a US security guarantee in Ukraine is critical to stop Putin from attacking again. It is welcome, it is welcome that we're now talking about negotiations. But as a Defence Minister, let me remind the House that we must not jeopardise the peace by forgetting about the war. President Trump has long expressed his wish for Europe to step up and take more responsibility for its own security. And he is right. Indeed, we are responding to that challenge. We are stepping up. Earlier this week, the Prime Minister announced the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. We are bringing forward our Labour manifesto commitment to spend 2.5% on GDP on defence to 2027, back to a level that has not been achieved since 2010, when Labour was last in government. Ahead of his visit to Washington today, the Prime Minister also announced, subject to our economic and fiscal conditions and aligned with our strategic and operational needs, that we will also set a clear ambition for defence spending to rise to 3% in the next Parliament. Through our strategic defence review that will be published in the spring, we are assessing the threats Britain faces and building the defence capabilities we need to meet them. We are also cutting waste in the Ministry of Defence, reforming procurement and reforming recruitment, including addressing some of the outdated medical standards that have been raised in this debate. We're prioritising investment in UK defence industries. And as a result, our armed forces will once again become fit to fight a modern war, learning the lessons from Ukraine and adapting to the evolving threats we face. Because we know that strengthening defence is the only way to win peace by deterring conflict, but defeating it if necessary. We're also stepping up and encouraging all our NATO allies to be spending at least 2% on defence, and with Britain spending 2.5% on defence from 2027, setting a new benchmark for others to follow as well. 2 weeks ago, I was leading a UK trade delegation in Ukraine with our Dutch and Norwegian colleagues. More joint ventures, more investment, more tech transfers of knowledge and data sharing in both directions is what we were talking about. This week, I visited Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark and the Netherlands to discuss with our close allies how we step up our collective support for Ukraine. Madam Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Slava Ukraini.
Sir Iain Duncan-Smith to wind up.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I should say at this point what a great idea it is that you are sitting in the chair, because you came out 2.5 years ago to Ukraine with me and with the charity, as others have done, and you were fantastic talking to troops suffering from PTSD, and they remembered it when I saw them again later. So I thank you on their behalf for that. This has been an excellent debate to send the message of unity to America, to the President of America, to tell him that this House is united in its support for Ukraine and believes if we have faith in Ukraine, then they will succeed, and there is no peace that is not durable that is worth the words peace. It needs to make sure that they have freedom and justice at the same time. But as we're finishing this, one small quote from the man in 1941 who was also appealing to a president of a nation of 130 million that was in isolation and was not likely to enter on our behalf. And the House, forgive me, it's very short, and I just want to remind it, because this is the sign we must send back to the man who has a bust of Churchill sitting in his office. This is what he appealed to the President of America at the same time, and on behalf of Ukraine, I repeat it. Put your confidence in us. Give us your faith and your blessing, and under providence all will be well. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle, nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job. Slava Ukraine.
Yeah. The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I'll give a few moments for the front benches to swap over.